Section 1. The Nature of the Beast. There is an organization in the Imperium of Man that most Imperial citizens will never hear of, never see, and never encounter, not because it is small or powerless, but because it is everywhere, moving through the shadows like a current beneath still water, pulling the strings of power and pressing its thumb down on the scale of history in ways that the ordinary people of the 41st millennium cannot even begin to imagine. This organization operates above the law of every world it touches. Its agents can walk into a room and ruin the career of a planetary governor with a word. They can commandeer warships, annex entire regiments of soldiers, and demand answers from generals, cardinals, and chapter masters alike. And if a world is deemed too far gone, too corrupt, too tainted, too lost, they can reduce it to ash and silence without a moment of formal approval from anyone. They are called the Inquisition, the Holy Orders of the Emperor's Inquisition, to use their full name, though most people who learn that name learn it far too late. And what the Inquisition is hiding is the kind of thing that, if you knew it, would fundamentally change the way you understood the Imperium you live in. Not because the truth is necessarily worse than what you already suspect, but because the truth is stranger, more layered, and far more troubling than the standard propaganda would ever allow you to believe. So let's start with what the Inquisition is. Not just the surface version, not just the seal and the rosette and the authority to execute, but the genuine, uncomfortable, lore-deep truth of what it is, where it came from, and why its very existence is a kind of confession about the nature of the universe it operates in. The Imperium of Man, as most of its citizens understand it, is an empire of faith. A billion worlds united under the golden light of the God Emperor, protected from alien savagery and demonic corruption by the sons of the Emperor, the Space Marines, and by the tireless soldiers of the Astra Militarum. In this version of things, the Imperium is embattled but righteous. It faces darkness but carries the light. Its institutions might be brutal, and its governance might be harsh, but at the core there is a truth they all serve, and that truth is the Emperor's will. That version of things is, to put it plainly, a story. The Inquisition knows the actual version. And the Inquisition has made it their business, their consuming, centuries-spanning, deeply serious business, to make sure that as few people as possible ever find out what that actual version contains. At the most fundamental level, the Inquisition answers to no one, not planetary governors, not chapter masters, not even the High Lords of Terra in any truly binding, day-to-day sense. Its agents, called Inquisitors, operate with a latitude of authority so absolute that the only practical limit on their power is other Inquisitors who might disagree with them. An Inquisitor carrying the inquisitorial rosette, that seal of office, that badge of nearly boundless permission, can walk into any room in the Imperium and do more or less whatever they believe needs doing in the name of the Emperor's protection. They can arrest, interrogate, execute. They can seize ships, troops, and resources. They can classify worlds as targets for exterminatus, and see that classification carried out with weapons that leave no survivors and no questions asked. This is not a small thing. This is the architecture of absolute power, dressed up in the language of holy duty. And the reason the Inquisition has this power, the reason it was given this power by the people who founded it at the end of the Horus Heresy, is deeply connected to what those founders knew and what they chose not to share. Because at the heart of the Inquisition's mandate, beneath all the ordos and the philosophies and the codified investigations into heresy and alien contact and demonic corruption, there sits a single foundational secret, one that shapes every other secret the organization carries. The universe is full of things that human beings cannot be allowed to know, because knowing them would break the faith that keeps the Imperium together. And once the faith breaks, there is nothing left to hold the species up against the darkness closing in from all sides. That is the secret at the center of it all. The Inquisition does not just hunt threats, it hunts knowledge. Specifically, it hunts the knowledge that would undermine the story, the managed, curated, carefully distributed story that allows 10,000 worlds of terrified human beings to keep functioning, to keep working, to keep fighting, to keep producing the tithes and the soldiers and the prayers and the psychers that the Imperium needs to survive another day. And the sheer scale of what falls under that category, the things the Inquisition suppresses, destroys, erases, redacts, or quietly buries in vaults that no one without the right clearance will ever enter, is breathtaking. Let's talk about all of it. Because if the Inquisition would rather you not know, that's usually the best possible reason to pull back the curtain and look at what's underneath. If you're watching this from somewhere interesting, a late-night session, a lunch break, across the world, drop a comment with your location and what time it is. I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. There is a lot more where this is coming from. Section 2, the Founding, what they left out of the history books. The Inquisition's own history is, fittingly, one of its best-kept secrets. There is actually a whole branch of the organization, the Ordo Originatus, dedicated entirely to uncovering the true story of how the Inquisition came to exist, because even its own members do not fully know. And working against the Ordo Originatus, deliberately and systematically, is another branch, the Ordo Redactus, whose entire purpose is to make sure those origins stay blurry, to obscure the past, to bury inconvenient records before curious eyes can find them. The Inquisition is literally fighting itself over its own history. That alone should tell you something. The version most people understand, the version that makes it into the authorized accounts, is relatively simple. In the final days of the Horus Heresy, as the galaxy burned and brother slaughtered brother and the great traitor fleets closed in on the Sol system itself, the Emperor ordered his closest companion, Malcador, the Sigillite, to gather people of exceptional quality, people of character, determination, and ironclad loyalty, people who could serve as investigators, as hunters of the hidden, as the Emperor's personal watchdogs against every manner of internal and external threat. Malcador gathered 12 such individuals, 8 of them space marines drawn from both loyal and traitor legions, and 4 of them mortal administrators and lords of the Imperium. He presented them to the Emperor, and from that seed, the Inquisition was born. But even this relatively clean founding story is wrapped in layers that most historical accounts choose not to mention. Those 8 space marines, for instance, the ones who were presented to the Emperor alongside the 4 mortal founders, their names were stripped from the records. Their original identities were made secret so thoroughly that even today, after 10,000 years of the Imperium's existence, the individual identities of the first Grey Knights, because that is what those 8 became, are known only in legend. Janus, Epimetheus, Chiron, Koios, Ogan, Iapto, Jotun, and Satre. Those are the names they are remembered by, but those are not the names they were born with, or the names they carried when they marched with the great legions of the Great Crusade. The reason for that deliberate erasure is worth considering carefully. Those 8 Space Marines were drawn not only from loyalist legions, some of them came from legions that turned traitor during the Horus Heresy. They had remained loyal in their hearts when their brothers fell to corruption, but the legions they had served in were damned. Having warriors who were born in treachery at the core of your most secret military force was not something that could be allowed to become public knowledge. The story of the Grey Knights requires them to be the purest of the pure, the most incorruptible weapons ever forged. And you cannot tell that story convincingly if you also admit that several of the founding members came from the same gene pools as some of the most infamous traitors in history, so the names were erased. The identities were buried, and the legend was constructed in their place. Malcador's role in this cannot be overstated, and the fact that Malcador himself is a deeply mysterious figure makes the whole thing considerably more complicated. Where did Malcador come from? How was he already at the Emperor's side during the Unification Wars? He claimed to be a member of an ancient order called the Sigillites, people who had dedicated themselves to gathering and preserving powerful artifacts and important knowledge from across human history. He had a longevity and a psychic resilience that defied normal explanation. Some have speculated that he was a perpetual, one of those rare individuals who cannot die in the conventional sense, who return from death as reliably as the tide comes back in. If that is true, if Malcador the Sigillite was truly a being who had walked through centuries before the Emperor ever set his eyes on conquest, then the founding of the Inquisition was not the inspired decision of a desperate moment. It was the culmination of a very long plan by a very old intelligence who had been watching humanity stumble toward catastrophe for a very long time. That changes the flavor of the founding considerably. An organization built in desperation by a loyal servant is one thing. An organization built with patient precision by an ancient, near-immortal being who had seen more history than most empires contain is something else. The difference in intention matters enormously. Then there is the second founding story, which contradicts the first in important ways, and which the historical record has simply allowed to sit alongside the first without resolving the contradiction, because the people who might resolve it have chosen not to. In this version, immediately after the emperor was interred and the golden throne broken, sustained only by the sacrifice of 10,000 psyker souls every single day, 4 trusted servants of the emperor gathered in secret to discuss what came next. These were the 4 mortal founders from Malcador's group, now standing on the other side of the most catastrophic war in human history, facing an empire on the edge of collapse, with no emperor to lead it and no clear path forward. They disagreed, profoundly and immediately. 2 of them believed the emperor could be brought back, that his condition on the golden throne was not permanent, that a way could be found to restore him to his physical form, that the right combination of technology and psychic power and sheer will could undo what the battle with Horus had done to him. These 2, remembered in legend as Prometheus and Moriana, left Terra to pursue this belief. They walked away from the organization being formed and went their own ways, their quest for the Emperor's resurrection, taking them out into a galaxy still reeling from the heresy's aftermath. The 2 that remained acted with urgency. They established themselves with the newly forming Senatorum Imperialis. They began recruiting, and the core purpose of what they built was, at least in part, to counter the efforts of the 2 who had left, to prevent any attempt at the Emperor's resurrection that might go catastrophically wrong, that might invite the wrong forces into the world, that might destabilize everything that was desperately being held together in those fragile years after the siege of Terra. Here is the deeply strange thing about that second story. Prometheus and Moriana are simultaneously described as founders of the Inquisition, and as people the Inquisition was created in opposition to. They are both inside the organization and outside it, founding members and rogue elements, creators and first targets, all at once. The lore does not resolve this contradiction cleanly, because it cannot. The history has been so thoroughly managed and countermanaged by the Ordo Originatus and the Ordo Redactus that the truth has become genuinely impossible to recover. The Inquisition's own founding is a historical mystery that the Inquisition itself has ensured will remain unsolved, and there is a breathtaking irony in that. The organization most dedicated to uncovering threats and exposing hidden truths has, for 10,000 years, systematically prevented anyone from uncovering the truth of its own beginnings. It hunts secrets with one hand and makes them with the other. It is simultaneously the detective and the criminal, the interrogator and the one who burned the evidence. What does it say about an organization when its defining nature is revealed by the story of its own founding? When the first thing it ever did, in its earliest days, was begin managing the narrative, protecting its image, obscuring its origins, controlling who knew what and how much. It says that from the very first moment of its existence, the Inquisition understood that knowledge is power, that the flow of information is a weapon, and that the most important secrets to protect are the ones closest to the source. The Inquisition was born in secrecy, shaped by secrecy, and justified by the keeping of secrets. Every other secret it carries is built on top of that original foundation. Strip everything else away, and what you find at the bottom is an organization that was designed from its first moment to be the thing that decides what humanity gets to know about the universe it lives in. And that decision has consequences that stretch across 10,000 years of Imperial history. Section 3. The Ordos you were never supposed to hear about. Most discussions of the Inquisition center on the 3 great Ordos Majoris, the Ordo Malleus, hunting demons, the Ordo Hereticus, hunting internal corruption, and the Ordo Xenos, hunting alien threats. These 3 are the pillars, the main bodies of the organization that most people who know anything about the Inquisition will have encountered in one form or another. But they are, in the grand scheme of things, the surface layer. The visible tip of something much more extensive, much stranger, and in several cases much more disturbing than the official structure suggests. The Inquisition also maintains what are called the Ordos Minoris smaller, more specialized branches, some openly acknowledged within inquisitorial circles, others so obscure that even senior inquisitors are unaware of their existence. And the things these smaller branches are tasked with investigating reveal, better than almost anything else, just how strange and how terrifying the edges of the Inquisition's mandate truly are. Let's start with the Ordo Sicarius, which is one of the more openly known of the minor ordos, but carries secrets that most Imperial citizens would find deeply alarming. The Ordo Sicarius was created after the Age of Apostasy, specifically in the wake of the Wars of Vindication, the bloody period following the fall of the tyrant Gog von Deer, to do something that on its surface sounds reasonable, to monitor and control the Officio Assassinorum, the assassin temples. The 6 or possibly more distinct organizations of professional killers maintained by the Imperium, each one specializing in a different method of targeted elimination. Vindicare snipers, Calidus shapeshifters, Eversor engines of biological rage, Culexus anti-psychic nulls. These are beings of terrifying capability, and during Van Deer's reign of blood, the temples had been corrupted, their loyalty bought or bent, their capabilities turned against the very imperial hierarchy they were supposed to serve. The response was the Ordo Sicarius, a hidden order of the Inquisition tasked with watching the Watchers, keeping tabs on the most dangerous killers in the Imperium. But here is what makes this more than just sensible institutional oversight. The Ordo Sicarius does not merely observe the assassin temples, its members are embedded within the temples themselves. Agents of the Ordo Sicarius are placed inside the trusted circles of high-ranking assassins, operating as part of the organization they are supposed to be monitoring from the outside. The Ordo Sicarius controls, or is supposed to control, the authorization process for every assassin deployed. By ancient decree, no Imperial assassin may be sent on a mission without majority approval from the High Lords of Terra. In practice, because getting that approval across a galaxy-spanning empire takes time that crises do not allow, an Inquisitor of the Ordo Sicarius will often sanction missions under the guise of a Terran edict, essentially acting as a proxy for a decision that the High Lords have not actually made. Think about what that means. There are secret agents of the Inquisition embedded within the most secretive killing organization in the Imperium, and those agents are authorized to send trained assassins anywhere in the galaxy, based on their own judgment, wrapped in the paperwork of an authority they are technically representing, but practically replacing. The Inquisition controls the assassins. The question of who controls the Inquisition is, as always, considerably murkier. Then there is the Ordo Redactus, which we mentioned in the context of the founding. This Ordo's mandate is extraordinary in its brazenness. The Ordo Redactus exists specifically to obscure history, to identify information about the Inquisition's past and the Imperium's past that could be dangerous in the wrong hands, and then to bury it, destroy it, or overwrite it with something more palatable. They are the Inquisition's own memory erasers, operating in direct opposition to the Ordo Originatus, who are trying to do the opposite. The existence of both these ordos, working against each other within the same organization, means that the Inquisition's own institutional history is a constantly contested battlefield, with some members desperately trying to uncover truth, and others equally desperately trying to prevent that uncovering. In the era Indomitus, the current era of the 41st and early 42nd millennia, the Ordo Redactus has faced a new and unexpected complication. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, returned from the brink of death, and has since thrown his considerable authority behind the project of discovering what actually happened in the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy. Guilliman wants accurate history. He has established bodies, called the Logos Historica Verita, historians working to piece together the truth of the Imperium's past, and the Ordo Redactus, whose entire reason for existing is to prevent exactly that kind of truth-seeking, is quietly moving against them. An inquisitorial ordo, part of an organization that ostensibly serves the Emperor, is working in the shadows to prevent the Emperor's own son from learning what really happened during the millennia of his absence. That situation says everything you need to know about where the Inquisition's institutional loyalties ultimately lie. Then there is the Ordo Obsoletus, which investigates what it calls unexplained phenomena and miracles across the Imperium. On the surface, this sounds like the Inquisition's version of a paranormal investigation bureau, and in some ways that description is not entirely wrong. The Ordo Obsoletus exists to answer a deeply uncomfortable question. When something miraculous happens, when the dead return to fight, when prayers are answered in ways that cannot be explained by normal physics, when saints appear or holy relics perform their stated functions, is that a genuine manifestation of the Emperor's divine will, or is it something else? Is it a trick, a chaos deception? An alien manipulation so subtle and so patient that it looks, from the outside, like divine intervention? The Ordo Obsoletus has to answer that question, case by case, incident by incident, miracle by miracle, across the entire breadth of the Imperium. And the answer matters enormously, because the Imperium's faith is its engine. The devotion of its citizens, the prayers of the billions who believe in the Emperor's divinity, actually feed something they are not, in the grim reality of the 41st millennium, merely symbolic. They have genuine psychic weight. And so the question of whether a particular miracle is real or manufactured is not just theological hair-splitting. It is an intelligence assessment with galaxy-spanning implications. What the Ordo Obsoletus has learned, and what it very carefully keeps to itself, is that the distinction between a genuine miracle and a sophisticated manipulation is often impossible to determine, even with the full resources of an inquisitorial investigation. The forces of chaos are not above spending enormous effort, enormous planning, and enormous sacrifice to make one thing look like another. Tzeentch, in particular, the changer of ways, the great deceiver, has shown across thousands of years of conflict that his long-term plots operate on timescales that dwarf human institutions. A scheme that begins in the 35th millennium might not bear fruit until the 41st. A miracle that the Ordo Obsoletus investigated and certified as genuine 10 centuries ago might only now be revealing itself as the first step in something deeply sinister. The Ordo Obsoletus cannot tell you how many of the Imperium's most sacred miracles are real. Neither can the Inquisition. Neither can anyone. And that uncertainty is one of the most carefully guarded secrets in a very long list. Because if the ordinary citizen of the Imperium understood that the miracles underpinning their faith might be deceptions planted centuries ago by the gods of chaos, the psychological consequences would be catastrophic. But the strangest of all, the minor Ordos, the one that carries the most quietly terrifying implications, is the Ordo Chronos. The Ordo Chronos was formed to investigate something that the Imperium has always known was possible, but has never wanted to confront openly. The fact that travel through the warp does not simply move you through space, it moves you through time as well. The warp does not operate by normal physical laws. A ship that enters the immaterium and travels for what feels like 3 months to its crew might emerge to find that 20 years have passed in real space. Or it might emerge before it left a genuine paradox, a loop in the causal structure of reality that the warp's unpredictability makes possible in ways that still make physicists and theoretical scholars deeply uncomfortable when they allow themselves to think about it. The Ordo Chronos was created specifically to investigate the implications of this, to understand what it meant for the history of the Imperium that some people existed outside of the normal flow of time, and to determine whether this could be deliberately exploited. Could someone use warp travel to send information backward through time? Could someone use the warp's temporal instability to change past events? Could the enemies of the Imperium use this to alter history in ways that would not be detectable until the damage was irreversible? These are not theoretical questions. They are operational concerns that the Ordo Chronos was tasked with answering. And then the Ordo Chronos disappeared. Every member, every agent, every inquisitor associated with it. In what appears, from the outside, to have been a single moment, a discontinuity in the records, rather than a gradual fading, the entire Ordo Chronos simply ceased to be present in any way that could be documented. No bodies were found. No ships turned up derelict. No final reports were filed. They were simply gone, and the silence they left behind was so complete that most inquisitors are not even aware the Ordo Chronos ever existed. The ones who do know are not talking about what they think happened. Whispers have circulated over the centuries, suggestions that the Ordo's investigations led them into something irreversible, that they found something in the warp's temporal landscape that could not be survived or escaped. Other whispers suggest it was voluntary, that the Ordo Chronos chose to disappear, stepped sideways out of the normal flow of time, as a deliberate act, for reasons that have never been explained. What makes this even stranger is that by the early 42nd millennium, the era Indomitus, the Ordo Chronos, appears to have reconstituted itself. Either its members returned from wherever they went, or new inquisitors formed a new version of the organization under the old name. And this new old Ordo Chronos has immediately become consumed by a bitter, internal conflict called the Chronostrife, an argument about the imperial dating system itself, which had been discovered to be deeply inaccurate. Centuries of records, classified by a calendar that turned out to be wrong, creating an uncertainty about when things actually happened in the history of the Imperium that might never be fully resolved. The Ordo Chronos returned from its mysterious absence and immediately began fighting with itself about what time it actually is. That is a sentence that belongs in a dark comedy, but it happens to be accurate, and the implications of a profoundly inaccurate imperial calendar. An Imperium that cannot reliably say in what order its most important historical events occurred are deeply unsettling if you allow yourself to sit with, and there are many more minor ordos. The Ordo Machinum, which watches the Adeptus Mechanicus and their technological hoarding with an eye that the Mechanicus finds deeply unwelcome. The Ordo Sanctorum, which monitors the ecclesiarchy for the heresy and corruption that tends to breed in any organization with that much power and that much money. The Ordo Militarum, which watches the Astra Militarum with the same suspicion the Inquisition turns on everything else. The Ordo Sepulchrum, which was created to deal with the zombie plague and other chaos-born diseases that began spreading with alarming speed in the years before the 13th Black Crusade. The Ordo Excorium, which monitors the use of exterminatus weapons and ensures or tries to ensure that the ultimate sanction is not being used carelessly or corruptly. Each of these exists because someone in the Inquisition looked at a part of the imperial structure, decided it needed watching, and created a dedicated apparatus to do the watching. And each of them carries its own collection of secrets, things discovered in the course of their investigations that cannot be shared, things that would be catastrophic if they reached the wrong ears. The Imperium watches itself constantly. It is an empire of mutual surveillance, of hidden eyes and quiet records and files sealed behind clearances that most people will never achieve. And at the center of that surveillance apparatus, holding more of the threads than any other single institution, sits the Inquisition. Section 4. The Black Ships and the Secret of What Happens to Psychers. Every 100 years or so, give or take, the considerable uncertainties of warp travel and bureaucratic scheduling, a fleet of ships arrives in orbit above a world of the Imperium and sends a message to the planetary governor. The message is calm and official and allows for no refusal. It is time to pay the tithe. Not the financial tithe, though that too is collected. This is a different kind of payment, a tithe of souls. The planetary governor is expected to have gathered, in the years since the last such visit, every individual on the planet who has exhibited signs of psychic ability. Everyone who hears voices that are not there, who makes things happen without touching them, who dreams with a sharpness and a power that occasionally reaches out and touches the world around them. Every man, woman, and child who glows, however faintly, in the psychic spectrum that the warp perceives as light. They are gathered, they are imprisoned, and when the ships come, they are handed over. The ships are called the Black Ships, and they are among the most feared vessels in the Imperium. Not because they are powerful in a military sense, though they carry considerable armament, but because of what they carry inside their vast, shielded, psychic-dampening holds. Thousands upon thousands of psychers, all packed into a vessel designed to contain the spiritual and mental pressure of that many awakened souls, in proximity to each other, all frightened, many in pain, most with no understanding of where they are being taken or why. The Black Ships smell of despair. The crews who serve on them, who have to live inside that continuous low-grade psychic broadcast of terror and grief and confusion, are considered to be performing one of the most spiritually grueling duties in the Imperium. They are mind-scrubbed regularly to prevent the accumulated psychic weight from breaking them. When the Black Ships arrive at Terra, which is where they go, eventually, after making their rounds of collection, the psychers are transferred to the Scholastica Psychana of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica for evaluation. And this is where the secret lives. Most Imperial citizens, if they think about the Black Ships at all, have been given a version of this process that presents it as a kind of sorting. The strong are trained, the weak are found another purpose. It sounds almost like a university entrance process, if you squint at it and try not to think too hard. The actual process is something quite different. When the Psykers arrive at Terra, they are assessed, yes. And some, a genuine minority, but still a significant number, are found to be strong enough, stable enough, and tractable enough to be trained. They become sanctioned Psykers, the astropaths who allow the Imperium to communicate across the galaxy, the battle Psykers who fight alongside the Imperial Guard, the librarians who serve in Space Marine chapters, the various practitioners who fill roles that the Imperium genuinely cannot function without. These individuals go through the process called soul binding, a psychic ritual in which the Emperor's own power, channeled through his sitting form on the Golden Throne, reaches out and stamps itself onto their souls, hardening them against possession and providing a measure of protection that allows them to function with their abilities under control. In the process, most astropaths are blinded, their physical eyes destroyed by the intensity of the contact with the Emperor's psychic presence. The trade site for service is considered by the Imperium to be entirely acceptable, but the Psykers who are not deemed strong enough for training, the ones who are too wild, too unstable, too consumed by their own uncontrolled abilities, too damaged by whatever the warp has already done to them in the years before they were collected. These people and they represent the vast majority of every Psyker tithe face a very different ending. They are sacrificed. Every single day, 1,000 Psykers die on Terra. Their souls are fed to the Golden Throne, their life force and psychic essence consumed to maintain the barely stable state in which the Emperor continues to exist. Without this constant daily massive sacrifice, without the continuous flow of souls being burned up to sustain the Emperor's psychic presence, the Astronomicon would go dark, the Emperor's guiding light in the warp would fade, and the Imperium's ability to navigate between the stars would collapse within a generation. The entire infrastructure of human civilization in this galaxy, the very thing that makes the Imperium's million worlds into something more than isolated, dying pockets of humanity on a sea of darkness, depends on those 1,000 daily deaths. This is not a secret that the Inquisition invented. It is one they inherited. The Emperor built this system, or allowed it to be built, or permitted it to continue in the understanding that there was no alternative. And the Inquisition's role is to make sure that the black ships keep running, that the tithes keep coming, and that the people handing their children over to the collectors never quite understand what they are actually handing them toward. The Inquisition has agents aboard the black ships for multiple reasons. Officially, they are there to screen the Psyker tithe for corruption, to identify any in the collection who have already been touched by chaos, who are already possessed or influenced or too far gone to be safe to transport. These individuals are dealt with quickly and quietly before they can cause problems on the voyage. Unofficially, the inquisitorial presence on the black ships also serves another purpose, the talent spotting and acquisition of the most promising Psykers before they ever reach the Scholastica Psychana. Many of the most powerful inquisitors in history began their careers as unwilling passengers on black ships, their gifts identified by sharp-eyed inquisitorial agents who saw something worth cultivating before the standard sorting process could consume it in one direction or another. The Inquisition recruits from the tithe, quietly and without formal permission, pulling the individuals it wants before the official machinery can claim them. What this means, in practice, is that the full number of Psykers sacrificed to the Golden Throne every year is not known precisely, even within the Inquisition, because the Black Ship's manifests and the Scholastica Psychana's records and the Inquisition's own acquisitions do not reconcile cleanly. People fall through the cracks of the counting system. The Imperium's Great Psyker Harvest is a massive operation with enormous leakage, and the leakage itself, the Psykers who disappear from the system rather than being formally processed in any direction, is another layer of secret that the Inquisition does not formally acknowledge. The Great Rift, the catastrophic tearing of reality that opened across the galaxy in the early 42nd millennium, has made this worse in ways that are not yet fully understood. When the rift opened, vast sections of the Imperium were cut off from Terra. The black ship routes that had run for 10,000 years were severed. Worlds that had been reliably harvesting their Psyker tithe every century suddenly found themselves with no ship arriving, no system to hand their collected Psykers over to. Some worlds improvised prisons. local containment facilities where psychers were held in increasingly desperate conditions. Others simply stopped collecting, allowing unsanctioned psychers to accumulate in their populations, creating time bombs of uncontrolled psychic power waiting to go off. And some worlds, the ones governed by people who understood the math of survival better than they understood loyalty to the imperial ideal, began finding other ways to meet their tithe quotas. Records exist, heavily suppressed by the Inquisition, of planetary governors hiring mercenaries to raid black ships belonging to other worlds, stealing their psyker cargo to fill their own quotas before the collectors arrived. The League of Votan's kindreds have been implicated in such operations, their services purchased by desperate governors who understood that failing to meet the tithe would bring consequences far worse than the moral cost of piracy. The Inquisition knows about these operations. The suppression of the records is not ignorance, it is deliberate, because the alternative to suppressing them is acknowledging the degree to which the Great Rift has shattered the system that the Imperium has depended on for 10,000 years. And that acknowledgement would raise questions about the long-term sustainability of a civilization that is currently consuming 1,000 souls a day to keep its single most critical psychic asset barely alive on a machine that is also failing. Section 5. What the Inquisition knows about the Emperor that you never will. Here is the fundamental, bedrock, most important secret the Inquisition keeps, the one from which all other secrets, in some sense, descend, the one that changes the meaning of everything the Imperium claims to stand for. The Emperor is not a god, and the Emperor might not be alive in any meaningful sense. And the Emperor's own plan, the thing he was working toward during the Great Crusade, the project he sacrificed everything to enable, was something so different from what the Imperium became, that the gap between intention and reality is almost impossible to comprehend. Let's take these pieces carefully, because each of them is significant on its own, and together they form something that the Inquisition has collectively decided the human species cannot be allowed to know. During the Great Crusade before the Horus Heresy, in the age when the Emperor was still physically present and directing his armies across the stars, he maintained what was called the Imperial Truth. The Imperial Truth held that the universe was fundamentally materialistic, that there were no gods, that the entities humans had worshipped throughout history were either alien beings or projections of collective psychology or simple delusions, and that rational, enlightened humanity had no need of superstition. The Emperor explicitly and publicly rejected any suggestion that he himself was divine. He was a man, an extraordinary man, a being of nearly incomprehensible power and intelligence, but a man who had made himself the champion of a rational, forward-looking human civilization. The Imperial Truth had a purpose beyond simple philosophical preference. The Emperor understood, in ways that most people did not, and that he could not share without causing the very catastrophe he was trying to prevent, that psychic belief has real consequences in the 41st millennium universe. The Chaos Gods are not metaphysical abstractions. They are real entities, emergent intelligences formed from the collective psychic output of thinking beings. They are made from emotion and belief. They are fed by worship. And the more people believe in something, the more that belief shapes the warp, and the more the warp shapes reality back. By promoting the Imperial Truth, by suppressing religion and demanding rational, materialistic thinking from his subjects, the Emperor was, at least in part, trying to starve the chaos entities of the psychic nourishment they needed to grow stronger. If humanity collectively stopped believing in gods, stopped projecting the psychic weight of devotion and terror and awe into the immaterium, the Chaos Gods would be diminished. Over time, perhaps, they could be weakened to the point where they no longer threatened everything. That was the plan. That was the Emperor's vision for what the Great Crusade would ultimately produce. And then Horus turned, and everything collapsed, and the Horus Heresy produced the single largest psychic event in human history, the most devoted, most sincere, most powerful collective emotional discharge imaginable. As billions of people experienced the grief and horror and betrayal of watching brother kill brother on a galactic scale, the Chaos Gods feasted. And the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, and everything changed. Because in the absence of the Emperor's direct leadership and the direct enforcement of the Imperial Truth, the suppressed religiosity of humanity, which the Emperor had never actually eliminated, only pushed underground erupted. Within a few centuries of the emperor's internment, the Adeptus Ministorum had been established. The emperor, who had spent his entire life insisting he was not a god, was declared one by official imperial policy. Temples were built, saints were canonized, miracles were certified, and the most powerful religious institution in human history was constructed in his name. The Inquisition, which had been founded by people who knew the emperor personally and understood what he had been trying to do, watched this happen. And the Inquisition made a choice. The choice was to allow it, more than allow it to protect it. To treat the emperor's divinity as an established fact that could not be questioned, and to execute anyone who publicly challenged it as a heretic. Why? Because the emperor was not there to correct the record, and because the religious framework, however wrong it was about the emperor's actual nature, was functionally the only thing holding the post-heresy Imperium together. A shattered, traumatized civilization, spread across 1,000,000 worlds, with unreliable communications and endless external threats, needed something to believe in that was bigger than individual planets, bigger than sector governors, bigger than anything that could be killed or corrupted. The Emperor as God provided that something. Killing the belief would have killed the Imperium. So the Inquisition chose the lie over the truth, and made that choice again, and again, and again, over 10,000 years. Every Inquisitor who takes their rosette and goes out into the galaxy to defend the Imperium is, in some sense, a guardian of a fiction that the Emperor himself would have found deeply troubling, and which the Inquisition's founders almost certainly found deeply uncomfortable, and which the Inquisition today maintains because stopping would be more dangerous than continuing. This is the original hypocrisy at the core of the Inquisition's existence. They were created in part to serve an emperor who believed in human rationality and the rejection of divine worship. They serve that same emperor today by prosecuting the practitioners of any religion that is not the worship of the emperor. They burn books that question the emperor's divinity, execute philosophers who ask whether his consciousness continues on the throne, and protect the institutional power of the ecclesiarchy, an organization the emperor never sanctioned and almost certainly would have opposed. But this is not the end of the emperor's secret. This is merely the most visible layer. The deeper question, the one that certain inquisitors have spent their entire careers trying to answer, is what the emperor actually is now. Is he still conscious on the Golden Throne? Does he still think, still plan, still act in any way on the events of the galaxy? The occasional saint rising, the Astronomicon burning, the scattered reports of the Emperor's will being made manifest in battle, are these evidence of an active divine intelligence, still guiding humanity, or are they something else entirely? Some inquisitors, the Thorian faction, which we will discuss in more detail shortly, believe that the Emperor's soul persists in the warp, in a form that could potentially be returned to physical existence, that he is not dead but displaced, not gone but waiting, and that the right combination of circumstances could allow his return. They watch living saints with tremendous interest, because there is a school of thought within the Thorian faction that suggests the Emperor's psychic essence is already trying to return, fragmenting itself across powerful psyker individuals who carry pieces of his vast consciousness without knowing it. Others, particularly the more militarily focused members of the Ordo Malleus, take a grimmer view. Their work brings them into close contact with the warp and with the nature of psychic consciousness within it. And what some of them have come to privately believe, based on decades of working at the boundary between the material universe and the immaterium, is that the thing sustaining the Astronomicon and maintaining the Golden Throne's function is not really the Emperor's consciousness in any recognizable sense. It is an enormous, diffuse, slowly fading psychic signal, the last resonance of a mind that was once the most powerful in human history, propagating forward through time like the light of a star that may have already burned out. If the Emperor is truly dead in every meaningful sense, if what sits on the Golden Throne is a psychic echo powering an increasingly unstable machine, then the entire theological and political structure of the Imperium of Man is built on the remains of a lie about a corpse. The Inquisition does not officially believe this. Officially, it cannot afford to. But privately, in the sealed archives of its deepest vaults, these questions are asked, and these possibilities are documented, and the people who have access to those records have to live every day with the knowledge that the answer, whatever it is, cannot be allowed to reach the general population because there is no version of that answer that does not collapse the thing they are all working to protect. Section 6. The Thorian Doctrine and the Plans to Bring the Emperor Back. If the Emperor's condition on the Golden Throne is the defining secret of the Inquisition, then the Thorian Doctrine is the most dangerous response to that secret. And the fact that it exists at all, that a significant faction within the Inquisition is actively pursuing a plan to resurrect or restore the Emperor, tells you something very significant about what the Inquisition actually believes underneath all its official positions. The Thorians take their name from Sebastian Thor, the remarkable individual whose preaching and leadership during the Age of Apostasy brought an end to the madness of Goj Vandier's reign of blood, and who is widely regarded as one of the most significant figures in the Devadus, post-heresy Imperium. Thor was not just a charismatic preacher. He was a man of evident and extraordinary psychic or spiritual power, someone whose abilities and whose presence defied easy explanation, someone who moved events on a scale that should have been impossible for a single individual without military force or institutional backing. The Thorians look at what Thor accomplished and ask a very specific question. What if he was able to do those things because he carried within him a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic essence? That question is the seed of the Thorian philosophy. If the Emperor's soul, the vast, ancient, enormously powerful psychic presence that was once the most extraordinary human being who ever lived, persists in some form in the warp after the body's functional death, and if that soul is actively trying to find a way back into the material universe, then it makes sense that it would seek vessels. It would reach out to powerful psychers, to extraordinary individuals, to people with the spiritual capacity to carry something of its weight. Living saints, perhaps, or individuals like Thor, who seem to be touched by something that transcends ordinary human capability. The Thorians believe that the Emperor can be reborn, that if the right vessel can be identified, prepared, and offered to the Emperor's waiting consciousness, then the spirit of the Emperor can cross from wherever it is, in the warp, back into real space and reclaim an active physical form. The Imperium could have its Emperor back, not a corpse on a machine, not a failing signal sustaining navigation. A living, thinking, acting entity of incomprehensible power who could actually do the things the official theology claims he is already doing from behind the Golden Throne. The Thorian faction has not achieved this. Obviously, the Emperor has not returned, but they are still trying, still watching, still maintaining their vigil over every individual in the Imperium, who shows the kind of spiritual power that might indicate a readiness to serve as a vessel. Living saints are studied, powerful psychers are observed. Records are kept of individuals whose deeds seem to exceed the normal boundaries of human capability in ways that suggest external enhancement rather than mere talent. Within the Thorian framework, several sub-factions have developed, each pursuing slightly different approaches to the same fundamental goal. The Cassiphilians focus on understanding the transition of the human soul from real space to the warp at the moment of death, and on understanding how that transition might be reversed, how a soul in the warp might be brought back into real space. They are among the most expert daemonologists in the Inquisition, not because they worship daemons, but because understanding how psychic entities cross the boundary between the warp and the material universe is directly relevant to the possibility of the Emperor's return. Their expertise is genuine, their intentions are sincere, and the information they have accumulated about the nature of souls in the warp is information that the Inquisition simultaneously values enormously and is deeply uncomfortable having exist. The Animolian beholders take a more passive approach. They believe that the Emperor's return is inevitable, that his power is already manifesting in the world through various individuals and events, and that the beholder's role is simply to watch and document these manifestations, to bear witness to the process they believe is already underway, and to be ready to recognize the moment when the Emperor's return becomes complete. The Revivicators go further still, studying the process of death itself in an attempt to understand how to reverse it. They have a strong interest in the Aeldari, whose spiritual culture and understanding of the soul's relationship to the warp is far more sophisticated than humanity's. Some revivificators have engaged in conversations officially deeply unauthorized with Eldari farseers, mining the Elder race's ancient knowledge for insights that might accelerate the project of the Emperor's restoration. And then there is the more extreme end of Thorian thought, which shades into territory that the more conservative elements of the Inquisition consider genuinely heretical. The Horusian faction, technically a subsect of the broader radical tradition rather than of Thorianism, specifically looks at the Thorian goal and agrees with it, while disagreeing entirely about the method. The Horusians believe that the power Horus manifested at the height of his corruption, the sheer, raw, galaxy-shaking force of a Primarch who had become a vessel for chaos, was the model for what the Emperor's return should look like. That to bring back an entity capable of actually making a difference in the current situation, you need not just a Psyker vessel, but a chaos-empowered vessel. That the Emperor, reborn through chaos power, would be something that could actually win. That position is considered by most Inquisitors to be so self-evidently insane that it is difficult to take seriously. But the Horusians are not stupid. Their argument is this: the Emperor lost his physical form in a battle with the chaos-empowered Horus. A version of the Emperor who has access to the same kind of power would not lose that battle again. The means are monstrous, but the ends are fully realized. Physically present Emperor who could actually turn the tide of a war that has been going badly for 10,000 years are exactly what every faction within the Inquisition claims to want. Most Inquisitors consider the Horusians to be evidence that the path from sincere conviction to catastrophic error is shorter than anyone would like to believe. Section 7 Exterminatus Records, Purges, and the Events They Buried. The most violent secrets the Inquisition keeps are not the ones about the Emperor's nature or the origin story of the organization. Those are the foundational secrets, the ones that shape everything else. The most violent secrets are the ones that accumulate with every operation, every campaign, every crisis that the Inquisition handles and then closes the file on. Because when the Inquisition handles something, it does not merely solve the problem. It controls the narrative of the problem. It decides what is known about what happened, who gets to retain their memories of it, and in extreme cases whether anyone who was present is allowed to continue living. The most extreme expression of this is exterminatus, the complete destruction of a planet's biosphere, the reduction of a living world to a dead rock, the death of every living thing on a surface that might have housed billions of people before someone in a gray coat and a rosette decided it was beyond saving. Exterminatus is the ultimate sanction, the last resort that only makes sense when the alternative is worse, when a chaos incursion has grown so powerful, when alien contamination has sunk so deep, when the situation has become so irreversible that no other outcome is possible. That is the official description. In practice, the threshold for exterminatus is more flexible than that official description suggests. There are Inquisitors and the lore names, some of them specifically, who have ordered exterminatus on worlds, not because the worlds were beyond saving in a military sense, but because saving them would have required letting the survivors live, and the survivors had seen things that could not be allowed to propagate. Worlds destroyed not to stop an enemy, but to prevent information from spreading. This is the logic of the Inquisition taken to its absolute endpoint. If knowledge is the primary threat, and if a world's entire population has been exposed to dangerous knowledge, then the cleanest solution is to ensure that population cannot share what it knows. The most documented case of this impulse in action is the Months of Shame, the events following the First War for Armageddon. Armageddon is a massive industrial world of enormous strategic importance, and during that campaign it faced the incursion of a chaos force led by a Daemon Primarch. The Space Wolves and other Space Marine chapters, the Astra Militarum, and eventually the Grey Knights all fought there. The Grey Knights fought in the open, visible to the world's population. Ordinary soldiers saw them. Regular people witnessed the battle. After the war was won, the Inquisition arrived with a very specific agenda. The Grey Knights' existence was one of the Imperium's most closely held secrets, and thousands of people now knew they existed. The Inquisition's solution was sweeping. The entire surviving civilian population of Armageddon, hundreds of thousands of people who had done nothing wrong, who had fought and suffered to defend their world, was to be quarantined, sent to labor camps scattered across the galaxy, sterilized to prevent their knowledge from being transmitted to children. The soldiers of the Armageddon Steel Legion, who had fought the Chaos Incursion with extraordinary bravery, faced similar fates. The Space Wolves, under Logan Grimnar, refused to allow this. They stood between the population of Armageddon and the Inquisitorial Task Force, and what followed was months of near-civil war within the Imperium Space Marines, who had just won a war against Chaos, turning their weapons toward the agents of the organization, supposedly on their side, because the organization had decided that protecting a secret was more important than the lives of the people whose home those Space Marines had just finished defending. This is not an isolated incident. It is the logical expression of a principle the Inquisition holds consistently. The protection of certain knowledge is more important than any individual life, any individual world, any individual anything. Secrets are not worth keeping if you are willing to let them escape when the cost of suppression becomes uncomfortably high. The Inquisition's secrets are maintained precisely because the organization is willing to pay costs that most people would consider unconscionable. The Edict of Obliteration takes this further in the historical dimension. When the Inquisition or the High Lords, or the Emperor himself before his internment, decides that an individual or an organization must not merely be punished but erased from memory, the Edict of Obliteration is invoked. Images are destroyed, records are burned, statues are broken, names are removed from every text that can be found. The goal is not punishment, but deletion, the removal of a presence from history so complete that future generations will have no knowledge the person or organization ever existed. The most dramatic example of this in the lore is the fate of the two lost legions, the two Space Marine legions, whose names and designations were struck from the records of the Horus Heresy era. Entire legions, thousands of Space Marines, the accumulated history of their campaigns gone. Not merely classified, not merely restricted, but actively deleted from the historical records so thoroughly that by the 41st millennium, even the surviving Primarchs speak only in vague terms of their existence, and the reasons for their erasure remain unknown outside the very highest levels of the Imperium's hierarchy. The Inquisition maintains is responsible for maintaining the continued erasure of those records. Whatever those two legions did, whatever their crime was that warranted being unmade from history rather than merely condemned, it is still considered sensitive enough in the present day that the suppression continues. 10,000 years have passed, and whatever they did is still considered too dangerous to be known. Think about the scale of what that requires. Every time new records are discovered, new artifacts recovered, new references found in ancient texts, the Inquisition has to evaluate and deal with them. Maintaining the erasure of something across 10,000 years of history is not a passive act. It requires constant, active, ongoing investment of resources. Inquisitors, whose entire careers are dedicated to finding and suppressing references to things that were erased before any of them were born. And all of this, the Armageddon Purges, the Edicts of Obliteration, the countless unnamed planets whose civilian populations were quietly dealt with after they witnessed something the Inquisition decided they should not have seen, represents the accumulated moral weight of an organization that has been making these decisions continuously for 10,000 years. Section 8 Radical Factions, Daemon Hosts, and the Chaos that Works from the Inside. The deepest philosophical divide within the Inquisition is between Puritans and Radicals, and understanding this divide reveals more about the organization's internal contradictions than almost anything else. Puritans believe that the Imperium's strength lies in its adherence to the Emperor's doctrines, that using forbidden knowledge, alien technology, or warp-based power will inevitably corrupt those who employ it, and that the corruption of the Inquisitors themselves is more dangerous than any external threat. They might more efficiently defeat by using such tools. Puritans maintain boundaries. They refuse certain weapons. They accept that some battles will be harder, or even lost, because fighting with tainted tools is worse than losing with clean ones. Radicals operate from a different premise. The threats facing humanity are so overwhelming, so diverse, so ancient, and so powerful that meeting them with only the tools that fall within standard Imperial doctrine is the equivalent of bringing a knife to a siege. Radicals believe, and many of them arrived at this belief after years of experience, that genuinely changed how they understood the nature of the threats they face, that you cannot fight chaos effectively if you refuse to. understand it, and you cannot understand it without engaging with it in ways that Puritanism forbids. The most extreme expression of radical methodology is the daemon host. A daemon host is exactly what the name implies. A daemon, a warp entity, a fragment of the malevolent intelligence of one of the chaos gods, given temporary material form, is bound into a human body through ritual means. The body serves as a cage and as an anchor, holding the entity in real space, where it can be directed, theoretically, by the Inquisitor who performed the binding. The result is a weapon of extraordinary destructive capability, a being that combines human physicality with the power of the immaterium, that can tear through enemies that normal weapons would struggle to affect, that operates according to the rules of the warp, rather than the rules of material physics. And it is absolutely unambiguously the kind of thing that the Inquisition officially condemns and would execute any ordinary citizen for creating or associating with. The radical inquisitors who use daemon hosts, and they exist, though they do not advertise themselves, have rationalized this in various ways. The daemon is bound. They control it. The destruction it causes is directed toward enemies of the Imperium. The power it provides is spent in service of humanity's survival. Every compromise has its justification, and the justification for the daemon host is that the alternatives are worse. What they rarely admit, and what the lore is careful to note repeatedly, is that binding a daemon is not the same as controlling one. Daemons are entities of pure chaos. They are fragments of intelligences that have existed since before the Imperium was founded, that have survived events that would erase civilizations, that understand the weaknesses of the human mind with a precision born of literally ages of observation and experimentation. A daemon in a daemon host cage is not defeated. It is not contained against its will, in any permanent sense. It is, at best, temporarily constrained, and it is patient. It has time, and the Inquisitor who keeps it around is feeding it opportunity after opportunity to corrupt, to influence, to wait for the moment of weakness that every living being has. The most famous documented case of a radical inquisitor's use of a daemon host is Gregor Eisenhorn, perhaps the most well-known figure in the canon of inquisitorial literature, a man whose career arc from principled Puritan to desperate radical to eventual exile is the most thorough portrait in the fiction of what this trajectory actually looks like from the inside. Eisenhorn, faced with an impossible situation, chose to use the daemon host Cherubale. He told himself it was necessary. He maintained that the outcome justified the choice, and he was not wrong in the immediate sense the situation was resolved, the threat contained. But the use of Cherubale marked him. It changed what he was. And the Inquisition, which had once been his home and his identity, eventually looked at what he had become and decided it needed to do something about him. The Xanthite faction formalizes this approach, named after Lord Inquisitor Rangdan Xenocides, who was executed for heresy in the 32nd millennium. Based on his alarmingly comprehensive knowledge of the warp and how to use it, the Xanthites hold that the only way to defeat chaos is to use its own power against it. That demon weapons, warp-based technology, and chaotic artifacts are valid tools in the right hands. That refusing to use them is a form of unilateral disarmament in the face of an enemy who is already using them against you. The Istvanians represent something even more disturbing. Named after the Istvan massacre, the moment at the start of the Horus heresy, when Horus Virus bombed the loyalist elements of his own forces, the catastrophic act that ignited the war, the Istvanians believe that conflict itself is the engine of human progress, that the Imperium grows stronger through crisis, that periods of peace make humanity weak, that comfort breeds the kind of stagnation that eventually allows existential threats to take root undetected, and that the correct response is to ensure that the fires of conflict never go entirely out. In practice, Istvanians will foment trouble. They will manufacture crises, provoke confrontations, create conditions for conflict in regions they judge to be dangerously complacent. They believe they are making humanity stronger. They are, by any conventional definition, agents of deliberate destabilization within the empire they claim to serve. The Recongregationist faction operates from a similar premise, but with a more specific target. Recongressors believe the Imperium is so thoroughly corrupted, so deeply rotten at every level of its institutional structure, that the only path to salvation is not reform, but demolition. tear it down, let it fall, and from the ruins, build something better. Individual recongressors have been found providing covert support to planetary rebellions, to popular uprisings, to the very anti-imperial cults that their colleagues in other ordos are simultaneously hunting down and exterminating. They are playing a very long game, and the justification for the civilian casualties that game produces is one that most people would find impossible to accept. What unites all of these factions, Puritan and radical alike, is the conviction that they are fighting for humanity's survival. They are not wrong about the threats. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is genuinely, actively trying to kill the human species in a dozen different ways simultaneously, and the people best positioned to understand the full scope of that threat are the Inquisitors who spend their lives investigating it. The disagreement is not about whether the threat is real. It is about what is acceptable in response to it, and the answer that different members of the same organization have arrived at, after centuries of independent investigation and deeply personal experiences with the horrors at the edges of Imperial space, ranges from the strictly principled to the catastrophically flexible. The Inquisition contains people who would execute radical colleagues on sight, and people who keep bound chaos entities in their personal chambers as weapons. It is one organization in the same way that a continent is one landmass technically accurate, but missing everything important about the vast differences within. Section 9. Alien Alliances and the Forbidden Technology the Inquisition knows about. The Imperium of Man's official position on alien species is simple. They are to be regarded as threats. The galaxy rightfully belongs to humanity, and the alien races that contest that claim the Orcs, the Aeldari, the Tyranids, the Necrons, and all the rest are to be opposed, contained, or destroyed, according to the scale of the threat they represent. Cooperation with Xenos species is not merely frowned upon in the Imperium. It is, for ordinary citizens, punishable by death. The Inquisition knows that this clean, official position is substantially false. Not in the sense that cooperation with Xenos is common or comfortable, it is, neither. But in the sense that the absolute prohibition the Imperium publicly maintains does not reflect the actual practice of Imperial institutions, including the Inquisition itself, when the situation on the ground demands flexibility that the official doctrine does not allow for. The Ordo Xenos, the branch of the Inquisition, specifically tasked with investigating and countering alien threats, has, in its institutional history, a long and complicated relationship with the Xeno species. It was created to oppose. Some of that relationship is exactly what you would expect. Inquisitors, who have spent their careers hunting alien incursions, developing an understanding of their targets so comprehensive that it shades, in some cases, into something that more puritanical colleagues would recognize as fascination. But some of it goes considerably further. There are documented cases suppressed within inquisitorial archives, but documented of Ordo Xenos Inquisitors maintaining ongoing working relationships with Aeldari Farseers. The Aeldari relationship with time and with prophetic vision is something that Inquisitors, who have worked with them long enough, come to genuinely respect, not because the Aeldari are trustworthy in the conventional sense, but because their information about future events has a track record that is hard to dismiss. Inquisitors who access the Aeldari's temporal knowledge and use it to prevent catastrophes that could not otherwise have been predicted are simultaneously doing exactly what their mandate demands, protecting humanity from threats, and doing exactly what their organization officially forbids. The cognitive dissonance involved in that position requires either a very flexible conscience or a very compartmentalized mind. The Xenos Hybris faction within the Ordo Xenos represents the formalized version of this approach. Xenos Hybrists argue that humanity must learn from alien civilizations, not emulate them, not worship them, not submit to them, but learn from the vast repository of knowledge that exists in alien cultures, technologies, and histories. The Aeldari have been studying the warp for longer than humanity has had written language. The Necrons have solved problems of physics and engineering that the Imperium cannot currently approach. The Tau have developed social models and technological approaches that the Imperium's stagnation prevents it from considering. All of this knowledge exists, And the Xenos hybrists argue that refusing to engage with it is a form of proud ignorance that the Imperium cannot afford in its current situation. Within the Inquisition's archives, there are records of xenotechnology that has been studied, analyzed, and in some cases, quietly incorporated into inquisitorial equipment. Weapons from races the Imperium officially seeks to destroy, scanning technologies developed by alien civilizations thousands of years old. Methods of psychic shielding adapted from techniques that were old when humanity was still living in caves. The Ordo Xenos maintains catalogs of this material formally classified, formally restricted, formally pretending not to exist, and uses it when operational necessity demands. The relationship between the Ordo Xenos and the Death Watch is worth examining in this context. The Death Watch is the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos Space Marines, drawn from chapters across the Imperium, and assigned to long-term duty hunting alien threats. Death Watch Space Marines, in the course of their service, study alien species in extraordinary depth. They need to understand the enemy to effectively fight it, and the information they accumulate about alien biology, alien psychology, alien tactical doctrine, and alien capability is classified above the level that most inquisitors would be cleared to access. The Death Watch is, in some sense, the Imperium's most comprehensive repository of practical knowledge about the species it is fighting, and that knowledge is carefully sealed away from the general population precisely because it is too useful to risk anyone using it in ways that were not officially sanctioned. Then there is the matter of the Illuminati, a secret society within the Imperium that intersects with the Inquisition in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to document, because the Illuminati take secrecy to a level that makes even the Inquisition look transparent. The Illuminati is composed of former Chaos worshippers who were possessed by daemons and then, through a process that should theoretically be impossible, expelled the daemon and retained their sanity. These individuals, called sensei in older lore, though the terminology has shifted, exist in a state that gives them an unusual relationship with the warp and with chaos. They have been touched by the enemy and are not corrupted. They have looked into the abyss and come back. The Illuminati, according to the most restricted inquisitorial records, has its own agenda. They know things about the Chaos Gods, about the nature of the warp, and about the Emperor's actual situation that most inquisitors do not. And their plan for addressing the Emperor's situation, their long-term project, for changing the direction of the conflict between humanity and chaos, is something that even the most senior inquisitors who are aware of, their existence cannot fully evaluate because the Illuminati does not share its full hand with anyone. An organization within the Imperium, connected to, but not subject to the Inquisition, that has access to information the Inquisition does not have, and is pursuing goals the Inquisition cannot fully audit. That is a description of an intelligence problem that, if the Inquisition were applying its normal analytical standards, would trigger an immediate and thorough investigation. The fact that the Inquisition knows about the Illuminati and has not simply destroyed it is itself evidence of how complicated the picture is when you get deep enough into the layers of the organization's operation. Section 10. The Grey Knights and the Secrets They Are Built On. The Grey Knights are, by every measure, the most extraordinary military force in the Imperium. A chapter of Space Marines drawn from gene seed that is believed on good but not absolutely confirmed evidence to be derived directly from the Emperor himself. 1,000 warriors, organized into 8 brotherhoods, every one of them a powerful psyker with mental defenses that dwarf what ordinary Space Marines can achieve, armed with Nemesis Force weapons that are specifically attuned to banish demonic entities, clad in Aegis armor inscribed with wards and protective symbols that make them resistant to psychic attacks, and operating from a fortress monastery on Titan, Saturn's moon, that is one of the most secure and secret locations in the entire Imperium. Every Grey Knight that has ever served in the 10,000 years of the chapter's existence has, as far as is documented, never fallen to the corruption of chaos. Not one. In an organization fighting literally the most corrupting entities in the universe, with direct and continuous exposure to the worst the warp can produce, every single member of the chapter has remained loyal and pure. That fact alone is extraordinary. But it becomes more extraordinary and more alarming when you understand what it implies about the cost of maintaining it. The Grey Knight's existence is one of the Inquisition's most jealously guarded secrets, Most people in the Imperium have never heard of them. Most Space Marines from other chapters have no idea they exist. And the Inquisition maintains this secrecy with a thoroughness that goes beyond keeping records classified or restricting access to information. When Grey Knights are deployed in situations where ordinary humans might witness them, those humans are subsequently dealt with, systematically, completely. Mind wipes are the preferred outcome, an unpleasant process that leaves the subject alive, but without the specific memories that could compromise the secret. But when mind wipes are not practical, or when the number of witnesses is too large for efficient memory alteration, other solutions are found. The Armageddon situation, discussed in the previous section, is the most visible example of this principle in action, but it is not unique. There are other instances, buried in inquisitorial records, that have varying degrees of access restriction, where entire populations were processed after they witnessed Grey Knight operations. The scale of the secret keeping required to maintain the Grey Knight's concealment from general knowledge across 10,000 years is staggering. It requires an ongoing commitment to actions that most people would describe as war crimes, repeated as often as necessary, with the justification that the secrets being protected are worth the cost. The founding of the Grey Knights contains its own layers of hidden information. The gene seed from which they were grown, if it truly derives from the Emperor, is knowledge of cosmic significance. The Emperor's genetic legacy was carefully controlled during the Great Crusade, with the 20 Primarchs representing the most visible expression of it, and the Space Marine Legions, carrying diluted versions of various Primarch gene seeds. A chapter that carries the Emperor's own genetic material directly would be, in an almost literal sense, his closest descendants, closer than any of the Primarchs, in some interpretations, because the genetic distance is smaller. The chapter does not discuss this openly. The possibility that their gene seed derives from the Emperor is noted in restricted records as an implication rather than a confirmed fact. Because confirming it would have implications the Inquisition is not prepared to manage. If the Grey Knights carry the Emperor's own genetic legacy, what does that mean for the theology of the Imperium? Does it make them divine, in the same sense the Emperor is claimed to be divine? What would the ecclesiarchy do with that information? What would ordinary Space Marines think about a chapter that was, in some sense, more directly descended from the Emperor than any of them? The questions do not have comfortable answers. So the record is left ambiguous, the confirmation is never formally made, and the Grey Knights continue operating in the shadows of the Inquisition's most heavily guarded section, knowing what they are without that knowledge ever being officially acknowledged. There is also the matter of what the Grey Knights' perfect record of purity actually costs. No one falls to chaos, not in 10,000 years of fighting demons. The obvious question is, how? The Inquisition's theology holds that this is a testament to the purity of their souls, to the quality of their gene seed, to the rigorous spiritual training they undergo before they are ever allowed anywhere near the battlefield. All of this is true as far as it goes, but the selection process for Grey Knight candidates is also extraordinarily intensive. The psychological screening alone makes the already brutal selection process for standard Space Marine chapters look gentle. Candidates who show any psychological trait that might eventually be vulnerable to chaos, influence any trace of ambition, resentment, obsessive attachment, grief strong enough to be weaponized, are rejected. The pool of potential candidates who survive that screening is tiny. And some of what happens to the candidates who fail the screening, but who already know things they should not by virtue of having been part of the selection process, is not something that gets into the official records at all. The Grey Knights maintain their perfect record partly through genuine purity, partly through extraordinary training, and partly through the aggressive removal of anyone who shows signs of not being able to maintain that standard. The Inquisition counts only the ones who made it. The ones who did not are not in any count that anyone outside the chapter would have access to. There is one final secret the Grey Knights carry that is worth mentioning because it touches on the strangest corners of established lore. Grand Supreme Master Malcador Drygo, one of the most senior figures in the chapter's history, is currently trapped inside the warp itself, the realm of chaos, wandering the immaterial territory of the dark gods in physical form. This has been his situation for an extended period of warp time, the precise duration of which is impossible to calculate given the warp's temporal instability. He has apparently managed to carve the names of fallen heroes into the foundations of demonic fortresses. He has apparently survived direct confrontations with greater daemons. The Inquisition does not know how he is still alive. The Inquisition does not know how he continues to function in the warp without being destroyed or corrupted. The Inquisition does not know whether the entity that is Caldor Drago in the warp is still the same entity that entered it, or whether it has been altered in ways that have not yet manifested but eventually will. And the Inquisition cannot retrieve him. The most powerful military force it commands, the most elite warriors in the Imperium, and the best they can do for their Supreme Grand Master is note that he is somewhere inside the territory of the enemy and assume he is probably still loyal. That last one is not exactly reassuring. Section 11. The Inquisition, the High Lords, and the game of power at the heart of the Imperium. The Inquisition officially answers to the Emperor. In practice, the Emperor is not available to give instructions. He sits on his throne, he maintains the Astronomicon, and he does not hold meetings. Which means that the Inquisition, in any practical sense, answers to itself, moderated by the reality that it operates within a political environment containing other extremely powerful institutions that it cannot simply ignore. The Senatorum Imperialis, the Council of the High Lords of Terra, the 12, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. Most powerful individuals in the Imperium is where the nominal governing of humanity actually happens. The High Lords include the Master of the Administratum, the Fabricator General of Mars, the Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum, the Ecclesiarch, and others. And the Inquisition has a seat at this table, occupied by whoever the Inquisition has decided to send as its representative at any given moment. That seat is not like the others. Other High Lords represent specific institutions with known memberships, fixed hierarchies, and predictable interests. The inquisitorial representative represents an organization that does not formally acknowledge most of its membership, that has no fixed hierarchy, and whose interests shift with every inquisitor who walks through a door. The other High Lords cannot predict what position the inquisitorial representative will take on any given issue. Because the Inquisition does not have unified positions, it has a collection of individual inquisitors, each operating according to their own judgment, with the full force of inquisitorial authority behind them. This makes the inquisitorial seat on the High Lords enormously powerful, in ways that have nothing to do with formal votes or procedural authority. The other High Lords know, because the history of the Imperium has made this clear repeatedly, that the Inquisition's interests are not always aligned with their own, and that the Inquisition has the tools and the willingness to take action against anyone, including other High Lords, if it decides that action is warranted. The Imperium's history contains records, heavily suppressed, of inquisitors investigating High Lords of Terra, of bringing cases against them, of, in some instances, seeing High Lords removed from their positions or condemned through inquisitorial processes that bypass the political protections that should theoretically shield the highest ranks of imperial governance. The High Lords know that the Inquisition can do this. This knowledge shapes every conversation at the Senatorum Imperialis in ways that are invisible to anyone who does not know the history. There is an event in imperial history called the Beheading, a moment when the Grand Master of the Officio Assassinorum, feeling slighted by the High Lords of Terra, resolved the dispute by having every single one of them assassinated. The Senatorum Imperialis was wiped out in a single night. The Imperium had no governing council for a period that caused enormous institutional disruption. This event led directly to the creation of the Ordo Sicarius and to the formal restriction of the assassin temples under inquisitorial oversight. But it also established, permanently and viscerally, that the people at the highest levels of imperial governance can be killed by the institutions they nominally oversee, and that the protections surrounding those positions are political rather than absolute. The Inquisition's relationship with Roboute Guilliman in the current era is one of barely suppressed tension. Guilliman, returning after 10,000 years in stasis and immediately appointed as imperial regent, has made it clear that he finds the current state of the Imperium, its stagnation, its superstition, its institutional corruption, its endless bureaucratic self-protection, deeply troubling. He wants accurate history. He wants institutional accountability. He wants reform. These are all things the Inquisition, in significant measure, opposes. Not because individual inquisitors are necessarily corrupt or indifferent to the Imperium's problems. Many of them are deeply, genuinely committed to humanity's survival. But the institutions, the Inquisition, protects the ecclesiarchy, the established theological framework, the narrative management that keeps 10,000 worlds stable, are exactly the institutions Guilliman wants to scrutinize and reform. The Ordo Redactus is working against the Logos Historica Verita. Individual inquisitors are monitoring Guilliman's reform projects. And Guilliman, who is, after all, a Primarch, and who carries his father's authority in a way that no inquisitor can really contest, is pushing back. When Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade, the great military campaign to reclaim the territories lost to the Great Rift, he funded it, in significant part, by seizing resources from the Inquisition and the ecclesiarchy. The official framing was that this was a legitimate requisitioning, consistent with the Primarch's authority as imperial regent. The inquisitorial response was quiet and not publicly documented, but we know it existed because the Inquisition always responds. It always documents. And somewhere in the sealed archives of its most restricted vaults, there are files on the Indomitus Crusade's financing that would make for fascinating reading if anyone with the right clearance ever chose to share their contents. No one has. No one will. Section 12, What We May Never Know. The Inquisition has been described as many things across 10,000 years of imperial history, a necessary evil, a guardian of dangerous truths, the last line of defense against threats that nothing else can handle, a corrupted institution that has lost sight of its original purpose, a pragmatic organization doing the best it can in a universe that does not reward idealism. An organization so consumed by the weight of its own secrets that it has forgotten what it was trying to protect in the first place. All of these descriptions are, at least partially, accurate. The Inquisition is large enough and varied enough and internally contradictory enough to contain all of them simultaneously, with different factions embodying different aspects of its complicated nature. What the Inquisition is hiding, the full, complete, unredacted answer to that question, is something that no living person fully knows because the Inquisition does not have a single unified understanding of its own secrets. Different inquisitors know different pieces. Different ordos have access to different archives. The Ordo Redactus has destroyed material that the Ordo Originatus was trying to find, which means there are things that even the Inquisition itself no longer knows. Truths about its own history that have been so thoroughly buried that they are gone permanently. The Emperor's actual nature and intentions. The true story of the Inquisition's founding. The fate of the lost legions, and what they did to earn erasure. The true number of exterminatus events that have been carried out, and the real justifications behind them. The full extent of the radical faction's activities, and how far their compromises have gone. The complete scope of alien knowledge that has been quietly studied and sometimes incorporated. The condition of the Golden Throne and how long it can continue. The question of whether the Emperor is still conscious in any meaningful sense. The possibility of his return, and whether any of the Thorian factions are closer to achieving it than anyone outside those factions would be comfortable knowing. These are the secrets at the center of the Inquisition's purpose. And the fact that they remain secrets after 10,000 years, that the organization has successfully maintained the concealment of information this significant across this long a period, is itself perhaps the most remarkable thing about the organization. The Inquisition is, among other things, proof that institutional secrecy is possible on a civilizational scale, that the determination to control information can override the natural human tendency toward disclosure, curiosity, and sharing. If the stakes are made clear enough and the consequences of speaking are made severe enough. Whether this represents a triumph of institutional design or a profound and ongoing tragedy for the human species is a question that different observers will answer differently. The Inquisition, if asked, would say it is both, and that is why the people who carry it forward do so with the weight they carry, because they understand, better than anyone outside their ranks, that the secrets they keep are not being kept for their own benefit. They are being kept because the alternative, the universe where everything is known and nothing is concealed, is one that the fragile, terrified, battered species they serve could not survive. Maybe that is true, maybe it is not. But it is the truth the Inquisition tells itself in the hours between investigations, in the private moments when the rosette is set aside and the person behind it is just a human being trying to understand what they are fighting for. The universe, in the end, does not owe humanity clarity. It offers darkness and fire, and the terrible, infinite complexity of a galaxy that does not organize itself around human comfort. The Inquisition stands between humanity and that darkness, armed with knowledge that no one else has, making decisions that no one else gets to review, and keeping secrets that no one else gets to know. Whether you find that reassuring or horrifying probably depends on how much trust you extend to organizations that answer only to themselves. In the Imperium of Man, that trust is not optional. It is mandatory, enforced by people wearing gray coats and carrying the seal of the Emperor, moving through the shadows of a civilization that exists in part because it does not know what it would have to face if the shadows were lifted. The Inquisition is hiding a great many things. The greatest thing it may be hiding is simply the full scope of what is required to keep humanity alive in this universe. And perhaps, just perhaps, it has decided that living with the secret is preferable to living with the knowledge. If you made it to the end of this, you are exactly the kind of person I make this for. Drop a comment. I genuinely want to know your thoughts on the Inquisition. Are they villains? Are they necessary? Are they the closest thing to heroes this universe has left? And if this is your first time here, subscribing costs you nothing and helps more than you might think. There is a great deal of lore left to pull apart, and we are just getting started. Script written for Q40K. All lore references sourced from Warhammer 40,000 sourcebooks, codex publications, and Lexicanum documentation. For 11 Labs voiceover optimization, pacing should be measured and unhurried throughout, with natural pauses at all paragraph breaks. Sentences are written for oral delivery. Extended section. The architecture of suppression, how the Inquisition controls, what the Imperium believes. To truly understand what the Inquisition is hiding, you have to understand the mechanisms by which it hides things. The organization did not simply decide to suppress information and then accomplish that goal through force alone. Force is part of it. The willingness to execute people who ask the wrong questions, to burn books that contain inconvenient facts, to sterilize populations that witness the wrong battle. But force on its own is a blunt and unreliable instrument for managing information at civilizational scale. You cannot shoot every person who has an uncomfortable thought. You cannot dispatch a kill team to every library that contains a dangerous text. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds, and even the Inquisition, with all its resources, cannot maintain total informational control through enforcement alone. What the Inquisition actually uses is a layered system of managed access, institutional compartmentalization, and narrative control so comprehensive and so old that most of the people participating in it do not know they are doing so. It has become, over 10,000 years, part of the basic structure of Imperial civilization, not an external imposition on an otherwise free society, but a fundamental feature of how information flows within the Imperium, baked so deeply into institutions and customs and unwritten rules that dismantling it would require dismantling the civilization it runs through. The first and most fundamental layer is what might be called the classification system, the straightforward restriction of certain types of information to specific clearance levels. This is not unique to the Inquisition. Every large institution uses classification, but the Inquisition's classification system has characteristics that distinguish it from the kind of bureaucratic information management you might find in more mundane organizations. The most important of those characteristics is that the classification system itself is classified. Not all of it. The existence of restricted information is not a secret, and there are publicly acknowledged categories of sensitive material within the Imperium. But the deeper levels of the system, the categories of information whose existence is itself not acknowledged, form a kind of meta-secret that sits beneath the ordinary classification structure. You can know that certain records are restricted. You are not supposed to know that there are categories of information for which the standard classification vocabulary does not have words, for which new terminology had to be invented precisely because the existing language for talking about sensitive information was itself too widely known. Inquisitors operate with access to multiple layers of this system simultaneously, and one of the genuinely disorienting aspects of inquisitorial training described in various Black Library sources through the experiences of characters navigating inquisitorial culture is the gradual discovery of how many nested levels of concealment exist. You discover a secret, and then you discover that the secret itself was concealing another secret, and that second secret points toward a third. And the process of uncovering nested layers of concealment is an experience that tends to fundamentally change how a person relates to the concept of knowledge itself. The inquisitorial rosette, the physical symbol of inquisitorial authority, the seal that an inquisitor shows when they want an imperial citizen to understand that resistance is not an option, is itself a device for managing access to information. When an inquisitor walks into a room and shows their rosette, they are not merely displaying authority. They are engaging an entire social and institutional mechanism by which people who hold sensitive information become obligated to share it. The rosette is, in a sense, an information extraction tool as much as it is a symbol of power, and the reason it works is that everyone who might hold sensitive information has been trained to treat it as such. The second layer of informational control is institutional design, the deliberate structuring of imperial organizations so that they do not possess more information than they need for their specific function, and so that the people within those organizations do not communicate across institutional boundaries in ways that might allow them to piece together pictures that their institutions are not supposed to have. Consider how this works in practice. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica manages the Black Ships and the Psyker Tithe. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains the Golden Throne. The Adeptus Custodes guard the Emperor's physical form. The Inquisition oversees the whole process and fills in the connecting tissue between these institutions. Each institution knows its own piece. The Astra Telepathica knows what happens on the Black Ships. The Mechanicus knows the Golden Throne's technical condition. The Custodes know the state of the Emperor's body. But no single institution, other than the Inquisition, has access to the information held by all the others simultaneously, which means no single institution other than the Inquisition can form a complete picture of what is actually happening to the Emperor and why. This is not an accident, it is engineered. The fragmentation of institutional knowledge is a deliberate design feature, not a bureaucratic quirk. It means that even if every member of the Astra Telepathica suddenly decided to share everything they knew about the Psyker Tithe, the picture that would emerge would be incomplete, missing the pieces held by the Mechanicus, the Custodes, the Inquisition, and other institutions that interact with different aspects of the same system. The complete picture exists only in the Inquisition's most restricted vaults, and even there, the individuals with access to the complete file can probably be counted on one hand. The third layer is what might be called narrative control, the active management of the stories that imperial institutions tell about themselves and about the universe. This is where the Ordo Redactus and the Ecclesiarchy intersect with the Inquisition most visibly, and where the mechanisms of control become most obviously connected to the daily experience of ordinary imperial citizens. The Ecclesiarchy tells a story about the universe. In that story, the Emperor is divine. His sacrifice was cosmic and meaningful. The forces of chaos are the enemies of everything good, and the correct response to all of this is faith, obedience, and service to the imperial creed. This story is comforting. It provides ordinary people with a framework for understanding the constant violence and hardship of life in the 41st millennium that does not leave them in total despair. It gives their suffering meaning, their obedience, purpose, and their deaths the dignity of sacrifice in a holy cause. The story is also, in several crucial respects, inaccurate. The Emperor was not divine in the way the Ecclesiarchy describes. The forces of chaos are not simply evil, they are emergent psychic intelligences, fed by real emotions that real human beings actually feel, which means that the hatred and fear and despair that the Imperium constantly generates through its brutal governance is literally feeding the things the Ecclesiarchy says it is fighting against. The correct response to the genuine situation is not necessarily faith and obedience. It might be something considerably more complicated and considerably less compatible with the continued operation of the institutions that depend on faith and obedience for their power. The Inquisition knows the real story. Or rather, different inquisitors know different parts of the real story, and no one knows all of it. But collectively, the Inquisition has access to enough of it to understand that the Ecclesiarchy's version is substantially mythologized. And the Inquisition's response to this knowledge is to protect the myth, because the myth is functional and the truth is destabilizing. This is the most fundamental tension in the Inquisition's existence, an organization founded to find and expose hidden threats, protecting the biggest hidden threat of all, the gap between the story the Imperium tells about itself and the actual situation it is in. Every inquisitor who understands the full picture, and many who understand only parts of it, has to make a personal decision about how to live with that gap. Do you maintain the fiction because the alternative is worse? Do you work within the system to address its worst failures, while leaving the foundational mythology intact? Do you become one of the recongregators and start working toward a demolition that might allow something better to emerge from the ruins? Do you fixate on a specific piece of the truth, the Emperor's potential return, the possibility of defeating chaos through unconventional means, the management of a particular alien threat, and pour everything into that work, leaving the larger philosophical questions for someone else to wrestle with? These are the choices that define what kind of inquisitor an individual becomes. And the variety of answers that different individuals have arrived at, across 10,000 years of inquisitorial service, is the explanation for why the organization looks the way it does, a vast, internally contradictory collection of people who agree on almost nothing, except that they are the ones who get to decide what everyone else knows. Extended section. The Illuminati, the Sensei, and the deepest conspiracy. There is a level of inquisitorial secrecy that goes deeper than the standard classification system, deeper than the debates between Puritans and radicals, deeper than the Indracudivation's institutional knowledge management discussed above. A level where the secrets are not merely operationally sensitive, but are genuinely, fundamentally world-altering, in a way that would make the ordinary revelations about the black ships or exterminatus statistics people look minor by comparison. This level involves what older lore refers to as the Illuminati and the Sensei, a conspiracy so buried, so contested, and so potentially significant that different inquisitors who are aware of it disagree fundamentally about whether it is a threat to be destroyed or a hope to be protected. The concept works like this. Among those who have been possessed by chaos entities who have had a daemon enter their mind and soul, take up residence in the most private spaces of their consciousness, and attempt to corrupt them from within, there are, extremely rarely, individuals who survive the experience, not in the sense that the daemon was destroyed before it could complete its corruption, in the sense that the person, through some combination of extraordinary willpower and psychic resistance and sheer individual stubbornness, expelled the daemon after the possession had already taken hold, and emerged on the other side of that experience with their sanity intact and their loyalty unbroken. These individuals are called sensei in the older texts, and they are considered by those who know of them to be something genuinely unique people who have looked directly into chaos, been touched by it in the most intimate possible way, and emerged from that contact with a quality that the warp cannot now reach. Not immune to chaos in the sense of being invisible to it, rather, changed by the contact in ways that leave no purchase for further corruption. The door has been opened and closed, and now it locks from the inside. The Illuminati is a secret society, composed partly of sensei and partly of individuals who have discovered the existence of sensei and decided that they represent something worth protecting. Their shared agenda, insofar as an organization operating in layers of secrecy, can be said to have a shared agenda, involves the long-term project of finding a way to address the fundamental problem of chaos, not defeating it in any conventional military sense, which has been shown across 10,000 years to be impossible, but addressing the conditions that make it so powerful, reducing its hold on the psychic infrastructure of the galaxy, finding a path through the current catastrophe that does not end with humanity simply being consumed. The Illuminati's specific theory about how this might be achieved is not fully documented in accessible lore, because the organization is so secretive that even the inquisitors who know it exists have not been able to reliably document its methods. But the general shape of their project involves the relationship between the Emperor's condition, the Astronomican's function, and the possibility that there is a way to transform the current situation rather than simply perpetuating it indefinitely. Some inquisitors who have encountered evidence of the Illuminati have treated it as a threat, a hidden organization with its own agenda operating within the Imperium, composed partly of people who were once chaos-touched, pursuing goals that have not been fully disclosed to any Imperial authority. By Puritan standards, this description alone would be sufficient to trigger an immediate and comprehensive investigation, followed by execution. Former chaos hosts, gathering in secret societies with unknown agendas? The Inquisition's reflex response to this description is not complicated. Other inquisitors, specifically those who have gone deep enough into the details to understand what the Illuminati actually represents and what the Sensei experience actually involves, have come to a different conclusion. These inquisitors argue that the Sensei are precisely the kind of resource that an Imperium facing its current situation needs: people who have crossed the boundary between corruption and redemption, and can provide information about that crossing that no one else in the galaxy possesses. People who understand chaos, not as an external threat, but as something they have survived from the inside. The argument between these positions has never been formally resolved, because the Inquisition cannot formally discuss the Illuminati without either acknowledging its existence broadly, which it does not want to do, or convening a conclave composed only of inquisitors who already know about it, which creates its own security risks. So, the Illuminati exists in a kind of institutional limbo, known to some, unknown to most, contested among those who know, and consequently, neither definitively protected nor definitively hunted. What makes this particularly interesting in the context of what the Inquisition is hiding is that the Illuminati may represent exactly the kind of development the Thorian faction has been hoping for. If Sensei exist, if there are people who can survive chaos corruption with their loyalty and their capabilities intact, that is relevant information for any Thorian who is trying to understand how the Emperor's consciousness might be preserved or returned. The Thorians study the boundary between the warp and the material universe. The Sensei have crossed that boundary in a way that no one else has, and survived. The intersection of those two facts is something that at least some Thorian inquisitors have noticed and are quietly pursuing. But the Illuminati does not cooperate easily with outside investigators, even sympathetic ones. They have survived this long precisely because they do not share more than they need to with anyone, including potential allies. The Inquisition, an organization defined by its ability to extract information from reluctant sources, has found the Illuminati to be one of the most resistant targets it has ever encountered. Not because the Illuminati is powerful in a military sense, but because it has no fixed structure, no central leadership, and no single point of failure that could be exploited to roll up the whole network. The most disturbing interpretation of the Illuminati's existence is not the one that treats them as a threat, it is the one that takes their projects seriously. If the Illuminati has been operating across the entire lifespan of the Inquisition, quietly working toward their goal of addressing the conditions that empower chaos, and if they have been doing this with access to information about the Emperor's situation and the nature of the warp that the Inquisition itself does not fully possess, then the Inquisition, the most powerful intelligence organization in the galaxy, has been operating for 10,000 years without knowing the full picture of what was being worked toward in the shadows beneath its own foundations. That is a secret within a secret within a secret. And it represents the version of the Inquisition that makes the most sense of all, an organization that is simultaneously the keeper of secrets and the target of a level of concealment so deep that even its most secret levels do not extend all the way down. Extended section: the Mechanicus, the Throne, and what the Tech Priests know. Among the many institutional relationships the Inquisition maintains, the one with the Adeptus Mechanicus is simultaneously the most important and the most fraught. And the secrets that sit at the intersection of these two organizations are some of the most consequential in the entire setting. The Adeptus Mechanicus is the organization responsible for maintaining the technology of the Imperium, everything from the humble lasgun to the vast war machines of the Titan legions to the ancient and increasingly unstable systems of the Golden Throne itself. They operate according to a religious framework built around the machine god, the Omnissiah, a deity who the Mechanicus equates with the Emperor, but who has a very different theological flavor from the Ecclesiarchy's version. The Mechanicus prays to mechanisms. They perform rituals over machines. They believe that the secrets of the universe are encoded in technology, and that the purpose of existence is to discover, preserve, and worship that knowledge. The Inquisition watches them through the Ordo Machinum, and the Ordo Machinum has a list of concerns about the Mechanicus that is very long and only partially reflected in the Inquisition's public position on them. The most fundamental concern is this: the Mechanicus hoards technology, not in the sense of maintaining reasonable operational security over sensitive systems, but in the comprehensive, institutional, centuries-old sense of treating the preservation of technological knowledge as more important than its deployment. The Mechanicus has archives on Mars and on Forge worlds across the galaxy, containing information about technologies that could, if released and applied, dramatically change the Imperium's situation in a number of conflicts. They do not release this information, not because they are malicious, but because the Mechanicus has a deep-seated cultural resistance to sharing technological knowledge outside the boundaries of the cult. The Inquisition knows about some of what sits in those archives. The Ordo Machinum has agents inside the Mechanicus, not deeply embedded in the way the Ordo Sicarius has agents inside the Assassin Temples, but present enough to monitor the general shape of what is being researched and preserved. And what they have been able to determine, based on the fragments that have escaped proper containment over the centuries, is that the Mechanicus possesses knowledge about pre-heresy technology that would be extraordinarily significant if it could be accessed and deployed. The Dark Age of technology, the era before the Age of Strife, before everything collapsed, was a period when humanity had achieved technological capabilities that the current Imperium cannot replicate, cannot understand, and in many cases, cannot even adequately document from the surviving records. Some of that technology was recovered during the Great Crusade. Some of it survives in the Mechanicus's most restricted archives. And some of it, the technology that the Emperor himself was reportedly working on in the webway beneath the Imperial Palace before the Horus Heresy interrupted everything, is so far beyond current Mechanicus understanding that the cult can only preserve it, not comprehend it. The Golden Throne is the single most critical piece of this picture. The Emperor's life support system, the device that sustains his consciousness and channels his psychic presence into the Astronomicon, was built by the Emperor himself, using technology that no one in the Imperium currently understands well enough to repair if it breaks. The Mechanicus maintains it. They perform rituals over it. They replace components that fail with approximations that sort of work well enough for now. But the underlying architecture of the throne is built on principles that the most senior tech priests of the Mechanicus cannot fully explain, and the slow accumulation of workarounds and approximations has left the device in a state that some of the more candid analyses, accessible only at the highest clearance levels, describe as progressively more fragile. The Inquisition knows this. The most senior inquisitors who have access to the reports produced by the Ordo Machinum's analysts know that the Golden Throne is failing. Not in a dramatic, immediate sense, not failing today or next year, but in the long-term sense that matters most for an institution thinking in decades and centuries. The throne is losing ground. The Emperor's ability to maintain the Astronomicon and his presence in the warp is not static. It is declining, very slowly, as the device that sustains him becomes gradually less able to do its job. What this means for the Imperium's long-term survival is not a question that has a comfortable answer. The Astronomicon is the backbone of Imperial navigation. Without it, the Imperium's communication and transport networks collapse. Without those networks, the Imperium is not a civilization, but a collection of isolated worlds, each facing the various existential threats of the 41st millennium alone. The prospect of the Golden Throne's eventual failure is the single most catastrophic possible outcome in a setting that is already saturated with catastrophic possibilities, and the Inquisition maintains the knowledge of its progressive deterioration as one of its most tightly held secrets. In the current era, with the Great Rift having torn reality apart and Guilliman's return having thrown the political landscape into a state of active upheaval, there have been references in the lore to the possibility of the Golden Throne being repaired or upgraded, that the ancient technology locked in the deepest vaults of Mars might contain information relevant to the throne's stabilization. This is precisely the kind of project that the Ordo Machinum exists to facilitate or obstruct, depending on the political situation within the Inquisition at any given moment. Some inquisitors would give everything to see that project succeed. Others are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of opening vaults that have been sealed for 10,000 years, because the Mechanicus's archives do not contain only helpful information. They contain everything that was considered important enough to preserve, which includes a great deal that was considered dangerous enough to require preservation rather than deployment. The secrets in those archives include knowledge of weapon systems so catastrophic they were never used even during the Horus Heresy. They include records of technologies whose operation principles cross into the same theoretical territory as chaos mechanisms, where the line between advanced physics and warp manipulation becomes ambiguous. They include documentation of experiments conducted during the Dark Age of technology that were abandoned not because they failed, but because succeeding at them produced outcomes that the people running them decided were too dangerous to continue. Some of what the Mechanicus is preserving is humanity's accumulated knowledge of how to destroy itself more thoroughly than it has already managed, and the Ordo Machinum's job includes determining which of those things can be touched safely and which cannot. Extended section living saints, miracles, and the Inquisition's uncomfortable relationship with faith. The Imperium of Man is a civilization built on faith, not metaphorically, but literally. The psychic weight of billions of people's sincere belief in the Emperor's divinity is a real force that has measurable effects on the warp and through the warp on material reality. Living saints are the most visible expression of this. Individuals who, by all observable evidence, have been empowered by the Emperor's divine will to perform acts that no ordinary human being should be capable of. Women and men who return from injuries that should be fatal, who fight on with wounds that would stop any unaugmented human cold, who move through battle with a grace and a power that suggests something is working through them beyond their own natural capability. Adepta Sororitas Saint Celestine is perhaps the most famous. She has died in battle more than once, and she has returned. Not metaphorically returned, physically returned, her body reconstituted, her strength renewed, her determination undiminished by the experience of death. She walks onto battlefields that should not be survivable and survives them. She fights forces that should be overwhelmingly superior and defeats them. She is, by any objective measure, miraculous. The Inquisition has a file on her. The Inquisition has files on every living saint who has ever been officially canonized, and a considerably larger number of files on individuals who showed characteristics consistent with living saint status, and were quietly investigated before any decision about their public recognition was made. The contents of those files represent one of the most sensitive categories of inquisitorial document, not because the saints are threats in most cases, they are clearly on the right side, but because the questions their existence raises are ones that the Inquisition cannot answer publicly. The most basic question is the one asked by the Ordo Obsoletus. Is this genuine? Is what Saint Celestine experiences actually the Emperor's will made manifest, or is it something else? The honest inquisitorial answer to this question is not a confident yes. The warp is not a place where the Emperor's will and the Chaos God's interventions are easily distinguished from the outside. A Nurgle daemon of sufficient power, attempting to build a long-term relationship with an individual or an institution, might perform apparent miracles for decades before the corruption became visible. Tiench's schemes, operating on timescales that dwarf human institutional memory, have been known to involve apparent divine interventions that were actually pieces of a far larger plan. So, every miraculous event the Imperium's faith generates also generates an inquisitorial investigation, and the records of those investigations, their conclusions, their uncertainties, their quietly noted possibilities that were never acted on, because the societal cost of disruption exceeded the evidentiary threshold for action, form a body of material that reveals, more clearly than almost anything else, how uncertain the Inquisition actually is about the nature of the faith it is protecting. What the files on living saints collectively suggest, when read by someone with access to enough of them, is a pattern. Something does appear to be acting through these individuals. The character of what acts through them is consistently recognizable. The qualities they manifest, the outcomes they produce, the choices they make in battle are consistent with a single underlying will. That consistency is evidence. It is not proof, but it is evidence. But evidence of what, exactly? evidence that the Emperor is still conscious and still capable of extending his will into the material universe through intermediaries. Evidence that the psychic impression the Emperor left in the warp is so powerful that it acts almost like a genuine intelligence, even if the original consciousness has faded. Evidence that the collective faith of billions of believers has created, in the warp, an entity that genuinely represents the Emperor's values, even if it is not in any direct sense the Emperor himself. These three possibilities are not equivalent. The first is the theology of the ecclesiarchy. The second is a kind of profound cosmic echo, meaningful, real in its effects, but fundamentally different from a living God. The third is perhaps the most alarming, because it would mean that what the Imperium worships as the Emperor's divine will is actually a construct of collective human belief, reflecting humanity's understanding of what the Emperor stood for, rather than the Emperor's actual intentions. The Inquisition does not know which of these is true. It has evidence that can be read to support all three. And it has made the institutional decision that none of this uncertainty should ever reach the general population, because there is no version of these possibilities that the ordinary citizen of the Imperium can engage with without either losing faith entirely or having their faith transformed into something uncontrollable and potentially dangerous. Faith in the Imperium is a resource. It is produced, managed, channeled, and consumed in the service of institutional goals. The ecclesiarchy refines it into political power. The Astronomicon uses it as fuel. The morale of the Astra Militarum is sustained by it on 100,000 battlefields simultaneously. The Inquisition cannot afford for that resource to be adulterated by genuine theological uncertainty, so the uncertainty is classified, the files are sealed, and the living saints continue their miraculous work, while somewhere in a vault on Terra, a file records all the ways that what they are doing might not be exactly what it appears. Extended section. The warp, daemons, and the ultimate secret. Everything the Inquisition suppresses connects, in the end, to a single foundational reality that the organization was, in large part, created to conceal. The warp is real, it is full of entities, and those entities are directly shaped by and responsive to the emotional and psychic output of the living beings in the material universe. The Chaos Gods exist because humanity and all other sentient species exist and feel things. They are the dark reflection of consciousness, the psychic pollution of a universe full of minds. And managing the information about this fact about what the warp is, what it contains, and what happens when it interacts with the material universe is the single most consequential ongoing project in the Inquisition's 10,000 years of operation. The reason knowledge of demonic incursions is classified so aggressively, the reason that entire populations have been purged, entire worlds subjected to exterminatus, entire battles hidden from the historical record, is that the knowledge of chaos is itself dangerous in ways that go beyond the simple political threat of destabilizing faith. When a person learns about the Chaos Gods, truly learns about them in a way that involves direct exposure to the evidence of their power, something happens at a psychic level that is not merely psychological. The warp takes notice, a consciousness that has become aware of the ruinous powers, that carries within it the image of what those powers are and what they do, becomes slightly more visible to the entities that inhabit the warp. The glow brightens a little. The attention drawn becomes slightly more likely. This is the horror at the core of the Inquisition's information management project. The thing they are protecting people from knowing about is also the thing that becomes more dangerous the more people know about it. The secrecy is not merely a political choice or an institutional prerogative. It is, according to the Inquisition's own internal analysis, a genuine protective measure against a real psychic threat that grows in direct proportion to human awareness of it. That is, if true, a remarkable situation. A secret that must be kept, not because revealing it would cause social unrest, but because revealing it would literally make the thing it describes more powerful. A self-reinforcing cycle of concealment, in which the act of protection is simultaneously the thing being protected against. Knowledge of chaos feeds chaos. Therefore, preventing knowledge of chaos starves chaos. This logic is not universally accepted within the Inquisition. The counter-argument held by various radical factions, and by some who do not consider themselves radicals at all, is that ignorance does not protect people from chaos. It merely leaves them without the tools to recognize and resist it. A citizen who has never heard of the ruinous powers has no defenses against their influence. When the warp bleeds through into their community, when a chaos cult begins operating in their hive city, when the first signs of psychic corruption begin to manifest around them, that citizen is entirely unprepared. Their ignorance does not make them safe. It makes them easy prey. Inquisitors who hold this view have, in various times and places, experimented with forms of limited, carefully managed disclosure, giving populations just enough knowledge about the nature of the threat to recognize its early signs, without exposing them to the full weight of what the warp contains. These experiments have had mixed results, and the records of both the successes and the failures are extensively documented in the Inquisition's archives, though access to them is heavily restricted. What the accumulated record of these experiments suggests is that the relationship between knowledge of chaos and vulnerability to it is not a simple linear function. More knowledge is not simply more dangerous. Less knowledge is not simply more protective. The nature of the knowledge matters. The context in which it is encountered matters. The individual receiving it matters, and the emotional framework in which it is understood matters enormously. The Chaos Gods are powered by emotion. Knowledge that generates terror, despair, or obsessive fascination provides exactly the kind of psychic fuel that strengthens the very entities it describes. Knowledge that generates determination, solidarity, and a calm commitment to resistance does not provide that fuel, or provides much less of it. The Inquisition has never successfully developed a way to reliably ensure that information about chaos, when disclosed, produces the second type of response rather than the first. Human psychology is not that controllable. So, the default position remains suppression, and the experiments in limited disclosure remain experiments, and the fundamental tension in the Inquisition's mandate between the need to protect through ignorance and the need to empower through knowledge remains unresolved after 10,000 years. The final secret, the one that sits beneath everything else, is therefore not a specific piece of information. It is a structural condition. The Inquisition does not know whether what it is doing works. It does not know whether the 10,000 years of secrecy and suppression and blood-soaked information management have actually made humanity safer or simply delayed an inevitable reckoning. It does not know whether the truth, fully disclosed, would collapse the Imperium or through some alchemy of human determination and collective will strengthen it in ways that the current managed fiction cannot. The Inquisition has made a bet. It has bet that secrecy is better than truth, that the managed narrative is safer than the actual situation, that the fiction can be maintained long enough for something to change, for the Emperor to somehow return, for chaos to somehow be defeated, for the Great Rift to somehow be closed, for a solution to emerge that allows the truth to be told from a position of security rather than from the current position of desperate, ongoing, extremely expensive concealment. Maybe the bet is right. 10,000 years is a long time to sustain any position, and the Inquisition has sustained it, which suggests either that the bet is correct or that the alternative would have been even worse. Maybe, in a universe where the Chaos Gods are real and the warp is what it is, managed ignorance genuinely is the least terrible option available. But maybe it is not. Maybe the Inquisition has spent 10,000 years feeding the very darkness it was created to fight, maintaining a fear-based, suppression-dependent civilization that generates exactly the kind of emotional turbulence, the despair, the terror, the resentment, the suffering that the Chaos Gods require to remain powerful. Maybe the Emperor's original vision, however impossible it has come to seem in the current state of the Imperium, was closer to the truth about what humanity needed than the organization that claims to serve him is willing to admit. That question does not have an answer that the Inquisition would be comfortable providing, so it will not be answered. It will be classified, filed, and sealed behind levels of clearance that almost no one will ever achieve. And the galaxy will continue to burn, and the 1,000 daily deaths will continue to feed the throne, and the black ships will continue to run their routes, and somewhere in a gray coat with a rosette at their collar, an Inquisitor will make another impossible decision in the name of protection, and another piece of the truth will disappear into the vault where all the other truths have gone before it. The Inquisition is hiding everything. And it is doing so by its own account, for your own good. Whether to believe that, after everything, is left as an exercise for the individual. Final extended section: The Future of Secrets, Era Indomitus, and what changes when a Primarch returns. Something has changed in the current era of the setting that the Inquisition has never had to deal with before, in all its 10,000 years of operation. A Primarch has returned, Roboute Guilliman, son of the Emperor, architect of the Codex Astartes, the being who set up the High Lords of Terra and the administrative structure that has governed the Imperium in the Emperor's absence. He is back. And he is not merely back in the sense of being alive and operational. He has been given the title of Imperial Regent, confirmed in that role by the Emperor's own apparent act of will. Whether the Emperor consciously reached out to confirm Guilliman's authority, or whether this was the Astronomicon doing something unusual is, of course, a matter of internal inquisitorial debate. He carries the Emperor's sword. He speaks with an authority that is not institutional, it is dynastic, inherited, as close to the genuine article as the Imperium can produce, with the Emperor unavailable. For the Inquisition, this is a situation with no precedent and no established playbook. The organization has spent 10,000 years operating in the space created by the Emperor's absence. Its power, its authority, its ability to define what the Imperium knows and believes, all of this was predicated on the Emperor not being present to contradict any of it. The Inquisition answers only to the Emperor, and since the Emperor does not speak, it effectively answers only to itself. That was the arrangement. That was the comfortable, well-established architecture of power. And now someone who speaks with something like the Emperor's authority is demanding transparency that the Inquisition has never provided and has no institutional mechanism for providing. Guilliman wants accurate history. He wants to know what actually happened in the 10,000 years he was absent. He wants to understand the actual condition of the Imperium, not the managed version that the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum have been presenting. He has the Logos Historica Verita. He has the authority to demand access to records that should theoretically be available to the Imperial Regent. He has the political will to use that authority. The Inquisition's response to this situation is revealing. On the official level, it is cooperating. Guilliman is the Imperial Regent. Refusing him openly would be politically catastrophic and potentially interpreted as treason by the very broad standards the Inquisition applies to everyone else. On the operational level, the Ordo Redactus is working harder than it has worked in centuries to ensure that what Guilliman's historians find is incomplete, that the most sensitive material is relocated before his investigators can find it, and that the records most likely to change his understanding of the organization's behavior over the past 10,000 years are not accessible in any archive that his people can reach. This is, by any reasonable analysis, the Inquisition acting against the explicit intentions of a legitimate imperial authority. It is the organization that was created to serve the Emperor's will, working to prevent the Emperor's son from understanding what has been done in the Emperor's name. The cognitive dissonance involved in that position is something that individual inquisitors within the Ordo Redactus presumably have to manage, and presumably manage in the same way that all the other cognitive dissonances of inquisitorial service are managed by focusing on the immediate operational necessity and not looking too hard at the larger picture. But Guilliman is not naive. He has been in stasis for 10,000 years, but he was, before that, one of the most capable strategic minds in the history of the human species. He knows what he is not being shown. He knows the difference between a complete historical record and a curated one. And his frustration with the institutions that are simultaneously claiming to serve him and working to prevent him from understanding what they are doing is documented in lore that does not spare his language on the subject. What this means for the Inquisition's long-term secrets is genuinely uncertain. If Guilliman persists, if he manages to push through the institutional resistance and access the records that the Ordo Redactus is trying to protect, then some of what the Inquisition has spent 10,000 years concealing will become visible to a being with the authority and the inclination to act on what he finds. Whether that would produce reform, rupture, or something the current political landscape has not yet imagined is a question that the Inquisition is very quietly and very urgently trying to answer, before the answer is forced on them from outside. The most optimistic version of this situation is that Guilliman and the Inquisition could, over time, develop a new accommodation, one in which the Primarch has enough information to understand why certain things were done, while the Inquisition retains enough operational security to continue doing what it genuinely needs to do. The least optimistic version is that what Guilliman eventually finds is significantly worse than what he expected, and that the resulting confrontation reshapes Imperial politics in ways that neither the Inquisition nor the broader Imperium is prepared for. The Inquisition is betting on the accommodation. It is simultaneously positioning itself for the confrontation. This is not a contradiction, it is just how the organization has always operated, hedging every scenario, managing every possibility, keeping secrets and making plans, and hoping that the future, whenever it arrives, is something the Imperium can survive. 10,000 years of practice at this. An organization defined by secrets, built on secrets, sustained by the keeping of secrets, standing at a moment when some of those secrets may finally, irresistibly, be running out of places to hide. What happens when the Inquisition's secrets are revealed? What happens when the story the Imperium has told itself for 10,000 years runs into something that cannot be classified or suppressed? The Warhammer 40,000 setting, in its current era, is the closest it has ever been to finding out. If you made it to the very end of this, I genuinely appreciate you spending this time here. The Inquisition is one of the most compelling institutions in all of science fiction, not because it is heroic or because it is villainous, but because it is both at the same time, and because the impossible position it occupies tells you more about the Imperium's true nature than almost anything else in the lore. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Are the secrets justified? Does the Inquisition serve humanity or betray it? And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is so much more of this universe to explore together, and we are only scratching the surface. Thank you for watching. End of script. Q40K. What are the secrets the Inquisition is hiding in Warhammer 40,000? All factual content sourced from Warhammer 40,000 official lore, Fandom Wiki, Lexicanum, Black Library Publications, and Games Workshop Codex materials. Optimized for 11 Labs text-to-speech, with natural paragraph breaks for pacing. No scene directions included per channel requirements. Extended section. The weight of the rosette, what it actually costs to be an Inquisitor. There is a version of the Inquisition that gets discussed a lot in surface-level coverage. The version where the Inquisitor is an almost mythic figure of authority, the powerful individual with the infinite license to investigate and execute, the human being who operates above the rules. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that miss the most interesting parts of the picture. What is it actually like to be an Inquisitor? What does it do to a person to spend years, decades, sometimes centuries, because Inquisitors often live far longer than normal humans due to various means of life extension, carrying the weight of everything the Inquisition knows? What happens to the human being inside all that gray-coated authority when the files in the sealed vault include things that no person with a functioning conscience can read without being changed? The answer, if you read the fiction and the deeper lore carefully, is that it does things that the job description does not include and that the organization does not officially acknowledge. It produces people who are almost unrecognizable from the outside as the individuals who first took the rosette. It produces ideological drift that can go in any direction toward the rigid Puritan certainty of someone like Fyodor Karamazov, who has ordered exterminatus on more than 30 worlds and does not lose sleep over it, or toward the increasingly radical accommodation of someone like Gregor Eisenhorn, who started as a principled investigator and ended as a man keeping a bound daemon as a weapon and being hunted by the organization he once served. The accumulation of secrets is a form of weight. Every Inquisitor carries classified information that they cannot share with anyone outside their immediate, trusted circle, and the nature of the information is such that even sharing it with a trusted circle creates new risks. The isolation this produces is genuine, and it is severe. Inquisitors interact with a world that does not know what they know, that cannot be told what they know, and that would be fundamentally different places in many respects, if it could. They watch ordinary people go about their lives within a narrative framework they know to be incomplete, and they are required to maintain that framework through their own choices and actions, which means that every day they spend doing their job is another day they participate in the concealment they intellectually know to be necessary. Over decades of this, it changes people in predictable and unpredictable ways. Some become more committed to the mission, the weight of knowing how bad things actually are, how close the various catastrophes always are to occurring, can make the mission feel more urgently necessary than ever. Some become more detached, the psychological mechanism of compartmentalization, used extensively enough over enough years, eventually produces individuals who can engage with the most horrifying material with an equanimity that looks, from the outside, like either extraordinary strength of character or a deeply concerning lack of normal human response. Some become radicals. Not because they started out wanting to cross lines, most radicals did not start out wanting to, but because the gradual accumulation of encounters with situations where the officially sanctioned tools were genuinely insufficient, combined with the knowledge of what was at stake if those situations were not resolved, produced a pressure that eventually overcame whatever principled resistance existed. The radical is not usually a person who decided to use forbidden tools because they wanted to. The radical is usually a person who arrived at a specific moment where the choice was between principle and outcome, and chose outcome, and has been living with the consequences of that choice for every year since. Gregor Eisenhorn's arc is the most thoroughly documented version of this trajectory, and it is worth spending time on it because it illustrates something crucial about the Inquisition that the organization's official self-presentation tends to obscure. Eisenhorn began his career as a member of the Ordo Xenos in the Scarus sector, a capable, principled, by-the-book inquisitor, with a reputation for effectiveness and a firm commitment to the boundary between permissible and impermissible methods. He spent decades building that reputation, accumulating trusted colleagues and a retinue of skilled individuals who worked with him because they trusted his judgment. And then the cases got harder, and the stakes got higher, and the situations he encountered presented themselves in ways that his original principles did not have good answers for. Each compromise was small and justified by the immediate circumstances. Each one was, in isolation, defensible. Taken together, across decades of service, they mapped a trajectory that eventually landed him in a position where he was using a bound daemon as a weapon, had been declared excommunicate by the organization he had given his life to, and was engaged in activities that would have had him executing other people earlier in his career. Was Eisenhorn a failure? The Inquisition's official verdict is, yes, a cautionary tale of how the radical path ends. But the lore treats him with more complexity than that verdict allows. Eisenhorn's choices, made in the circumstances he faced, with the information he had, were not obviously wrong. They were wrong by the standards of a principled Puritan who did not have to face what he faced. Whether those standards remain meaningful when applied to situations they were not designed to handle is a question the Inquisition has never definitively answered, because definitively answering it would require either condemning everyone who has ever made a radical choice under genuine necessity, or acknowledging that the Puritan framework is incomplete. So, the question stays open. And Inquisitors continue to move along the spectrum between Puritan rigidity and radical flexibility, each finding their own position in response to the specific experiences their careers produce, and each carrying the accumulated weight of what they know and what they have done in the Emperor's name. The longevity factor adds another dimension that is worth considering separately. Inquisitors who use various life extension methods, juvenate treatments, occasional use of psyker life force techniques, access to technologies that the general population does not have, can live for centuries while the world around them changes. The people they worked with early in their careers age and die. The institutions they interacted with evolve, reform, corrupt, fall, and are rebuilt. The threats they spent decades combating, transform, adapt, spawn successors, and the Inquisitor remains, carrying memories of how things were alongside observations of how they have become, with the particular weariness of someone who has seen too many iterations of the same patterns to maintain the same emotional freshness about them that younger colleagues bring to their first encounters. There is a kind of temporal loneliness built into the long careers of successful Inquisitors, the experience of watching everyone you knew in your early years disappear while the work continues unchanged and the secrets stay sealed, and the galaxy keeps burning. The lore names Cawl Cinderman, later known as Inquisitor Lastan Nimajun Veritas, as someone who survived for 1,500 years before finally being killed in the War of the Beast. 1,500 years of service, 1,500 years of the weight of inquisitorial knowledge, 1,500 years of watching the things he loved and protected and fought for, gradually transform into something he could barely recognize. His final conversations, described in the War of the Beast series, reveal a person who has reached a kind of clarity, available only to the very old, a stripped-down understanding of what actually matters and what can no longer be sustained. He was the last of the original 4 founders to know the truth about the Grey Knight's founding, and in the moment of his death he shared it, because some truths should not be allowed to die with the person who carries them. That choice to share the truth, at the cost of everything the Inquisition had spent 15 centuries protecting, is perhaps the most honest moment in the history of the organization. An individual, at the end of an impossibly long life, deciding that the weight of the secret had finally been carried far enough and that the truth deserved someone to know it, even if the system would have preferred otherwise. The Inquisition does not celebrate moments like that. It notes them in sealed files and moves on. But they happen. They keep happening. Because the human beings inside the organization, beneath all the authority and the classified knowledge and the decades of service, are still human beings. And human beings, at the end, have a tendency to want the truth to survive them, even when the institution they served wanted it buried. Extended section: The Enemy Within, when Inquisitors Fall. The Inquisition's greatest institutional fear. The scenario it has the most elaborate systems to detect, prevent, and respond to is not an alien fleet, or a demonic incursion, or a planetary rebellion. These are threats from outside, and however catastrophic they can be, they are at least clearly distinguishable from the Inquisition itself. They come from the other side. The Inquisition knows what it is fighting. The fear that sits deepest in the organization's institutional consciousness is the corrupted Inquisitor. The person who spent years, perhaps decades, doing genuine, valuable work in the Emperor's service, and then crossed a line willingly or unwillingly, through deliberate choice, or through the accumulated pressure of too many necessary compromises, and became the thing they were supposed to be hunting. A corrupted Inquisitor is a qualitatively different threat from any other form of chaos corruption within the Imperium, and the reason is the clearances. The Inquisitorial Rosette opens doors that nothing else does. An Inquisitor who has been turned knows the organization's methods. They know how investigations are conducted, what patterns inquisitorial agents follow, what early warning signs the Inquisition trains its people to recognize. They know where the files are, which archives exist, what resources can be accessed, and how. A corrupted Inquisitor is not merely a powerful enemy. They are an enemy equipped with a complete map of the organization's defenses and a key to its front door. The history of the Inquisition includes cases of corrupted Inquisitors, and the records of those cases represent some of the most heavily restricted material in the organization's archives. Not because the corruption itself is the deepest secret corruption of individuals by chaos is something the Inquisition deals with constantly, but because of what the investigation of those cases reveals about the organization's vulnerabilities. A full accounting of how many Inquisitors fell, what methods they used, what damage they caused before they were identified and stopped, and what organizational failures allowed them to operate for as long as they did, would be deeply damaging to the Inquisition's institutional reputation. The reputation it needs to maintain, to exercise the authority it requires to function, so those records are sealed. The organization that exists to expose and destroy hidden threats hides the full extent of the threat that it has, periodically, posed to itself. The most significant documented case of an Inquisitor-level corruption in the current era is harder to discuss with specificity because the most sensitive material about current-era events tends to be the most thoroughly restricted, but the broader Warhammer 40,000 fiction contains enough examples through characters like Inquisitor Tor, Garradon, through the chaos-corrupted Inquisitors, who appear as antagonists in various Black Library stories, to establish that this is not a theoretical risk. It happens. It has happened. It will continue to happen as long as Inquisitors are doing the kind of work that exposes them to the materials and experiences that produce corruption. The Inquisition's internal monitoring system, the way inquisitors watch each other, report concerns about colleagues, and convene secret trials within the organization is more active than the official literature suggests. The image of the utterly independent inquisitor, answerable only to their own judgment and the emperor's will, is accurate as far as it goes. But it omits the reality that experienced inquisitors develop informal networks within the organization for exactly this purpose, for sharing information about colleagues whose behavior is starting to look concerning, for building consensus before taking action, for ensuring that a difficult decision about one of their own is not made by a single individual in isolation. These informal networks are not documented anywhere. They cannot be, because documenting them would expose them. They exist through interpersonal relationships, through decades of accumulated trust between individuals who have worked together or who have been trained by the same masters, or who have developed mutual respect through their encounters at conclaves and shared investigations. They are the Inquisition's immune system, informal, distributed, resistant to compromise, because they have no formal structure that can be identified and subverted, and they have failed before, they will fail again. Because no immune system is perfect, and because the people running these informal networks are themselves inquisitors, which means they are themselves carrying the weight, dealing with the isolation, and subject to the same pressures that have turned other inquisitors in the past, the organization watches itself. But the Watchers need watching too, and in the Inquisition, the Watchers of the Watchers are also inquisitors, and the chain never quite resolves into something outside the organization itself. In the end, the Inquisition is its own last line of defense against its own worst possibilities, and that is a position that contains a structural vulnerability that no amount of institutional design can fully address. The Inquisition knows this. It has known it for 10,000 years, and it has decided that this is preferable to the alternative of having some external body with oversight over the organization, because any external body would need to be given access to information that cannot safely exist outside the Inquisition's own control, and the cure would be worse than the disease. So the organization monitors itself, and sometimes fails, and files the failure in the sealed archives alongside everything else, and moves on. Because moving on is what the Inquisition does. It has always moved on. The work continues. The secrets are kept. And somewhere out there, in the darkness between the stars, an inquisitor is looking at something they were never supposed to see, and beginning to understand, for the first time, just how deep the vault goes. This is the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition. This is what it is hiding. And this is why, in the grim darkness of the far future, the most frightening question is not what the enemies of humanity are doing in the dark. It is what the people who fight them are not telling you. Thank you for making it through this. If you found value in this exploration of one of the richest and most layered institutions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, leave a comment, share the video, and subscribe. There are no simple answers in the 41st millennium, and that is precisely what makes it worth exploring. Extended section: the Phainonites and the most dangerous radical position. There is one radical faction within the Inquisition that most discussions of the organization's internal philosophies tend to skip over, either because it is so extreme that it sounds like a parody of the radical position, or because the people who know about it in the lore prefer not to draw attention to it. The Phainonites represent, in one sense, the logical endpoint of a certain kind of radical thinking, the position reached when you follow the logic of extreme pragmatism all the way to its terminus and discover what lives there. The Phainonites believe that the current structure of the Imperium is so fundamentally broken, so deeply corrupted at every level, that the only valid response is to take control of it, not to reform it from within, as the recongregators attempt, not to tear it down and let something better emerge from the ruins, as the most extreme recongregator positions suggest, but to seize it to place the Inquisition itself, or a specific vision of what the Inquisition could be, in direct command of the Imperium's institutions, and to force the renewal they consider necessary, rather than waiting for it to occur through normal processes. This is as close as the Inquisition's internal politics gets to a coup ideology. The Phainonites are not merely radicals who use forbidden tools. They are radicals who have decided that the Emperor's sanctioned institutions have failed so thoroughly that their own authority and their own judgment should replace those institutions. They believe, in effect, that they know better than the systems they were created to monitor, and their plan is to act on that belief. The Fainanites are relatively few in number, because arriving at their position requires a specific kind of long-term disillusionment combined with a specific kind of ego, the conviction that your individual judgment, or the judgment of your faction, is not just better than the current system, but good enough to justify overriding it by force. That combination is not common even among inquisitors, who are, as a group, not known for excessive modesty. But it exists, and when it produces an organized faction rather than a lone inquisitor making catastrophically bad decisions in isolation, the institutional threat is significant. The Inquisition's response to known Fainanites is about as unambiguous as the organization ever gets. They are hunted, not monitored, not watched, not given the kind of careful observation reserved for radicals whose crimes are more ambiguous. The Fainanites represent a direct challenge to the Inquisition's own authority structure, because if the Inquisition can be led by individual inquisitors who have decided to override imperial institutions by force, then the concept of the inquisitorial rosette as a symbol of legitimate imperial authority collapses. The organization depends on being recognized as an instrument of the emperor's will. Inquisitors who are using it to serve their own vision of what the Imperium should be, against the wishes of the legitimate institutions, are undermining the foundation on which everyone else's authority rests. So Fainanites get hunted by other inquisitors. The records of these hunts, which amount to the Inquisition prosecuting its own members with the same ruthlessness it applies to external threats, are among the sealed files that the organization does not publicize, because the existence of Fainanites is itself a confession that the Inquisition contains people whose ambitions extend to taking over the Imperium. That is not a confession the organization wants to make in a form that anyone outside the organization can read. But the Fainanites exist because the conditions that produce them exist. An organization given nearly limitless authority, operating in secrecy, answering only to itself, staffed by exceptional individuals who have spent years watching the institutions they are supposed to serve fail repeatedly and catastrophically. The emergence of factions that eventually decide that they should simply be running things is almost predictable. The wonder is not that Fainanites exist. The wonder is that there are so few of them. The Inquisition manages this by making the culture of the organization strongly resistant to this trajectory. The ethos instilled during inquisitorial training, that the Inquisitor serves the Emperor through the Imperium's institutions rather than instead of them, is reinforced constantly in formal and informal ways throughout an Inquisitor's career. The stories told about Inquisitors who fell into this kind of thinking are not told as cautionary tales in the simple sense. They are told as horror stories, as accounts of the worst possible outcome of taking the authority of the Rosette seriously in the wrong way. The lesson is not just, this is wrong. The lesson is, this is the thing that makes everything you have done meaningless, and everything you are trying to protect vulnerable. Whether that lesson is effective enough to fully contain the risk is something the sealed archives know, and no one else does. Extended section. The Inquisition's records on the Tyranids and what they mean. There is one threat that the Inquisition has grappled with that is different in kind from almost everything else it deals with, because it presents a form of existential danger that none of the Inquisition's traditional methods are well designed to address. The Tyranids, the hive fleets, the children of the Great Devourer, are not a chaos incursion or an alien empire or a political subversion. They are a biological force of incomprehensible scale, a collection of organisms so numerous and so psychically linked that their aggregate presence in the galaxy produces a detectable effect on the warp called the shadow in the warp, a psychic dampening that blocks communication, navigation, and the use of psychic powers within its range. The Inquisition's files on the Tyranids represent some of the most carefully managed material in the organization's archives, for several specific and interconnected reasons. The first is scale. The Inquisition's standard approach to threats involves containing information, managing the narrative around the threat, and deploying specific assets to address it. With the Tyranids, the scale of what is coming makes the standard approach look inadequate in a way that the organization cannot entirely conceal from its own internal analysis. The hive fleets that have arrived so far, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and others, are, according to the best analysis available within the Inquisition, vanguard elements. The full mass of the Tyranid swarm is still in the intergalactic void beyond the galaxy's edge, moving toward the Milky Way at a pace that is slow by cosmic standards, but relentless and, as far as can be determined, unstoppable by any means the Imperium currently has available. The Inquisition has files that estimate the full scale of the Tyranid threat beyond what is currently visible in the galactic rim. Those estimates are classified at the highest levels because sharing them with the general population, or even with most of the Imperial military establishment, would produce a despair response that the Imperium cannot afford. If the Astra Militarum soldiers who are fighting Tyranid incursions knew the full scale of what was coming, the motivation to fight hard and die well, rather than to flee and seek some other outcome, would be severely undermined. Faith requires manageable stakes. It cannot easily be sustained against an enemy that the most pessimistic analyses suggest is literally too numerous to defeat. The second reason the Tyranid files are so sensitive is what the Ordo Xenos has discovered about the relationship between the Tyranids and the warp. The Tyranids have no warp presence in the conventional sense. They do not use the warp for travel or communication, and they do not generate the psychic signature that most forms of life produce in the immaterium. This makes them immune to many of the tools the Imperium uses against Chaos-Touch threats, and it raises questions about their origin and their purpose that are not fully answered by any current theory. Specifically, if the Tyranids are not from the warp and do not use it, what are they? Where did they originate? The most widely held theory is that they come from another galaxy entirely, that the Milky Way is simply another feeding ground in a pattern of galactic consumption that has been repeating for longer than humanity has existed. But this theory, while it explains the physical evidence, leaves open a question that some Ordo Xenos analysts have been quietly circling for decades. Could the Tyranids have been engineered? Could the most effective possible predator of psychic species, an organism that strips worlds clean and consumes all life, that produces no warp presence itself, and leaves only silence behind, be a designed weapon rather than a natural phenomenon? If the Tyranids were engineered, who made them? For what purpose? In a universe that contains the Chaos Gods, the Necrons with their star-killing weapons, and the remnants of countless ancient civilizations with technologies humanity cannot currently comprehend, the possibility of a weapon engineered to consume galaxies is not impossible. It is not even particularly unlikely when measured against the general character of what the 41st Millennium universe turns out to contain. And the implications of that possibility for who the Tyranids' makers were, whether those makers still exist, what their relationship is to the other existential threats the Imperium faces, are something the Ordo Xenos discusses in documents so restricted that even most Inquisitors who deal with Tyranid threats regularly do not have access to them. The third reason, which connects back to the Inquisition's most fundamental concerns, is the shadow in the warp. When a significant Tyranid force is present, the shadow disrupts warp communication, blocks warp navigation, and interferes with psychic powers, including, and this is the part that matters most, the Astronomicon. If the Tyranid hive fleets grow large enough, and if they advance far enough toward the galactic core, the Astronomicon's signal could be disrupted at the source, or blocked from reaching the vessels that depend on it for navigation. The prospect of a Tyranid fleet so massive that it effectively blocks the Astronomicon is something that the most senior analysts within the Inquisition have been modeling for decades. The conclusions of those models are in the sealed archives, alongside the throne's maintenance reports and the estimates of the full Tyranid swarm scale. They are not shared outside the organization's highest levels, because the appropriate response to those conclusions is not something that can be communicated to anyone who does not already understand the complete picture of the Imperium's vulnerability. What the Inquisition knows about the Tyranids, and what it is hiding about what it knows, represents in microcosm the full weight of the organization's fundamental problem. The truth about what the Imperium actually faces is so overwhelming, so far beyond the capacity of conventional faith and courage and institutional resilience to address, that the managed lie is the only tool left. Keep the Astronomicon burning, keep the soldiers fighting, keep the faith functioning, and bury the numbers in a vault where they can be known by the people who absolutely have to know them, and hidden from the people whose morale and whose continued functioning the Imperium cannot afford to lose. The Inquisition is not merely keeping secrets about its own history or about the Emperor's nature. It is keeping secrets about the future, about what the Ordo Xenos' best analysts believe is coming, and when, and how severe it will be when it arrives. That category of secret may be the most consequential of all, because the future has not yet happened, and there is theoretically still time to change it. But you cannot change a future you cannot talk about, and you cannot talk about a future that is classified beyond the clearance of the people who would need to act on it. The Inquisition holds these secrets because it has always held secrets. It holds them because the mechanism for keeping them has been running for 10,000 years, and it does not have a reliable alternative. And it holds them, in the end, because the people who run it genuinely believe, with varying degrees of confidence and varying degrees of despair, that this is the least terrible option available in a universe that does not offer good options. Whether they are right is a question that will be answered, eventually, not by any decision the Inquisition makes, but by what happens when the events they have been managing finally arrive at a scale that cannot be managed anymore, when the hive fleets close in, when the Golden Throne finally gives way, when the warp storm tears the last pieces of the old Imperium apart and leaves something that must either evolve or end. That moment is closer now than it has ever been in 10,000 years. And the Inquisition, keeping its secrets in its vaults, is doing what it has always done, watching, managing, suppressing, and waiting for a solution that has not yet presented itself. The galaxy burns. The Inquisition keeps its secrets. And somewhere, among all the things it is hiding, there might still be the piece of the puzzle that makes survival possible, or there might not. That, too, is classified.